In the winter of 1944, the most powerful army the United States had ever put on European soil woke up one morning to find itself losing a battle it didn't know it was in. That sentence should stop you, because it's not a metaphor. It's not a dramatic flourish borrowed from a thriller. It is the documented, verified, historically irrefutable truth of what happened on the 16th of December, 1944, when more than 200,000 German soldiers emerged from the fog of the Belgian Ardennes and struck an Allied line that nobody, not the generals, not the intelligence officers, not the most cautious analysts in the building, had seriously prepared to defend. The largest land battle in American military history didn't begin with a warning order or a strategic debate in a wood-paneled room. It began with artillery shells landing among men who were sleeping. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. I've spent a long time with this history. Not weeks, longer than that. I've read the after-action reports and the intelligence assessments and the memoirs of generals. I've read the letters that soldiers wrote home in the days before the battle and the oral histories they gave decades after it, when the cold of the Ardennes had become something they carried inside them rather than something they were standing in. And what I can tell you, sitting here with all of that material in front of me, is this. The Battle of the Bulge is not a simple story. It never was. The popular version, the encirclement, the nuts reply, Patton's dramatic relief column, is real and it's important, and we'll get to all of it. But the real story is bigger than that. It's messier, it's more human, and it's more worth understanding than any version I've seen told in a single documentary, a single chapter, or a single famous quote. That's why this exists. What you're about to experience is 15 chapters and several hours of the most thoroughly researched, most deliberately paced, most human account of the Battle of the Bulge that I know how to produce. This is not a highlight reel. This is not a summary built for an algorithm. This is the kind of documentary that starts at the beginning, the actual beginning, the autumn of 1944, the specific failure of Allied intelligence, the specific psychological state of a German high command that had run out of rational options and was gambling everything on one last offensive, and doesn't stop until it reaches the actual end. The graves, the villages, the veterans' memories, the lessons that the battle carved into the doctrine of every Western army that came after it. I made this because I was tired of the version of this story that fits inside 40 minutes. I was tired of the version that starts at Bastogne and ends at Bastogne and treats everything else as background. The men who held Elsenborn Ridge, who stopped the most powerful SS armoured force in the offensive dead in its tracks, and whose success made everything else possible, deserve more than a paragraph. The two regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, who found themselves surrounded and outnumbered on the Schnee Eifel on the second day of the battle. 8,000 men who surrendered in the largest single American capitulation in the European theatre, deserve more than an asterisk. The Belgian civilians who woke up one December morning to find the war had come back to their village, again in the coldest winter of their lives. They deserve to be in this story too, and they are. Let me tell you what December of 1944 actually looked like from inside the Allied command structure, because it explains everything that came after. The Allied armies in the autumn of 1944 were winning. Clearly, demonstrably, measurably winning. Paris had been liberated in August. The German retreat from France had, at moments, looked like a rout. American divisions had crossed the border into Germany itself. The mood in Allied headquarters was not complacent in the lazy sense. These were professional soldiers who worked long hours and took their jobs seriously. But it was optimistic in a way that, as we will see, had begun to distort the way ambiguous evidence was being read. When your intelligence assessments say the Germans are finished, and your commanders agree, and your fellow analysts agree, and the operational picture on the map in front of you seems to confirm it, it takes a specific kind of intellectual courage to look at the fragmentary evidence pointing in the other direction and say, wait, something isn't right here. Nobody said that. Not clearly enough, not loudly enough, not in time. And so the attack came as a surprise. Not a total surprise. The historical record, examined carefully, shows that the warnings were there. Captured German soldiers had spoken of a coming offensive. Photo reconnaissance had shown unusual activity behind the German lines. A message decoded from Japanese diplomatic traffic had contained a reference to Hitler's himself, telling Tokyo that a large offensive in the West was being prepared. 5 days before the attack, 9th Air Force Headquarters had issued a warning about German air activity. None of it was acted on with sufficient urgency. The dots were almost connected, and the failure to connect them, the specific, documented, institutionally generated failure to take those warnings seriously, is one of the most important intelligence lessons in the history of Western military operations. We will examine it closely and carefully and without flinching from what it means. Now let me tell you about the German side of the line, because it is just as fascinating and just as human. And because understanding it is essential to understanding why the battle was as close as it was. Adolf Hitler's decision to launch a major offensive through the Ardennes in December of 1944 was, by the judgment of virtually every senior German military commander who knew about it, a strategic fantasy. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, called it far too ambitious. Field Marshal Model, who would command the army group conducting the attack, said it hadn't got a leg to stand on. The generals who received their orders at a briefing in mid-December sat in an underground room and listened to Hitler lecture them about Frederick the Great and the will of the German people, and they went out afterward knowing, most of them, that the plan they'd been ordered to execute had requirements it could never realistically meet. Enough fuel to reach Antwerp, a timetable that demanded crossing the Meuse in 4 days, a theory of Allied political collapse that bore no relationship to the actual state of the Anglo-American alliance. And yet, they assembled more than 300,000 men, roughly 2,100 tanks and assault guns, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces. They moved all of it into position at night, in strict radio silence, hidden under trees and in barns, and in the cellars of farmhouses, without Allied intelligence detecting any of it. The operational security they maintained was, by any measure, extraordinary, among the most effective deception operations of the entire war. The army that couldn't launch a major offensive somehow assembled the largest German force committed to a single operation in the entire Western campaign. The men who said it was impossible then went out and very nearly made it work. That tension between the rational military judgment that the plan was doomed and the extraordinary professional execution of it anyway is one of the defining paradoxes of the Battle of the Bulge, and we will live inside it for 15 chapters. I want to take a moment here to tell you about the men on the ground. Not the generals, we'll spend plenty of time with them, but the infantry soldiers and tankers and artillery crews and engineers and medics who actually fought this battle in conditions that I don't think language fully captures, but which I've tried to reconstruct as faithfully as the documentary record allows. The cold was not incidental. The cold was the battle's second enemy, and in some weeks it was the deadlier one. The Ardennes winter of 1944 to 45 was one of the coldest on record in the region. Many American soldiers arrived without adequate winter clothing, still in cotton field jackets, some in summer weight uniforms. They dug foxholes in ground, frozen as hard as concrete, in forest where the roots of fir trees fought the shovel. And then they discovered that being in the foxhole wasn't safe either, because German artillery detonated in the tree branches overhead, sending shrapnel downward into the positions that were supposed to protect them. By the end of the battle, frostbite and cold injuries had produced roughly 45,000 non-combat casualties in American forces alone, a number that equaled or exceeded direct combat casualties in some units. Men lost fingers, men lost toes, men lost feet, in a war that produced suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. The specific grinding of the American soldier in the Ardennes in the winter of 1944 is something worth being precise about. We will be precise about it. The men on the German side were cold too. They were also running out of fuel and ammunition and food, operating at the end of supply lines that Allied air power, once the weather cleared on the 23rd of December, was attacking around the clock. The letters they wrote home, some of which were captured and translated by American intelligence, described the gap between what they had been told the offensive would achieve and what they could see from their own positions, with a plainness that institutional military communication rarely allows. These were not monsters. They were soldiers, fighting in conditions that nobody with a choice would have chosen, for a cause whose moral dimension is settled by history, even if its human texture requires more careful handling. We will handle it carefully. Let me tell you what this documentary is going to do. We are going to probably start with the autumn of 1944, and we are going to take our time there because the intelligence failure that allowed the German offensive to achieve complete surprise is not something that can be understood in 2 sentences. It has sources, and the sources are institutional, and they matter enormously for what came afterward and for what military organizations have tried to do differently ever since. We are going to trace the German planning, the specific documented arguing in the room process, by which Hitler's strategic fantasy was translated into an operational plan that his generals privately opposed and professionally executed with remarkable skill. We're going to spend time with the ghost front in the days before the attack, with the thin, exhausted, green American forces holding an 80-mile line that nobody thought was worth attacking. And we are going to be in those positions when the shells start landing on the morning of the 16th of December. We are going to follow all 3 German axes of advance, not just the famous one to Bastogne, all 3. We are going to spend real time at Elsenborn Ridge, where the northern German thrust was stopped cold by 2 American divisions, one experienced, one in its first real engagement, and where the outcome of the entire battle was substantially determined by events that have never received the popular attention they deserve. We are going to follow Kampfgruppe Pieper, the SS armoured spearhead that drove furthest and fastest and ended its fighting career, stranded in a Belgian field, its tanks dry. We are going to follow the 106th Infantry Division into the trap on the Schnee Eifel, and we are going to stay with those men, because their story is as much a part of this battle as any other. We are going to sit inside the Bastogne perimeter for as long as it takes to understand what it was actually like. Not the famous quote, not the relief, but the 7 days before the relief, when the ammunition was rationed and the surgeons were operating in farmhouses without adequate supplies, and the men were digging foxholes in iron-hard ground in temperatures that cracked rifle stocks. We are going to spend time on the command controversy, Montgomery's press conference, Eisenhower's near ultimatum, the specific kind of damage that national pride can do to a military alliance under pressure. And we are going to be honest about what the historical record does and doesn't support. We are going to follow the counteroffensive through January, and we are going to be precise about how grinding it was, how the Allied push back across the same ground that had been lost in December was not a triumphal march, but a cold, costly, kilometre by kilometre advance against an enemy that fought retreating with the same professionalism it had fought advancing. And we are going to end where any honest history of this battle has to end. Not with the last gun, but with the graves, and the veterans' memories, and the civilian communities of Belgium and Luxembourg, who rebuilt their lives in the ruins left by a battle they never asked for, and with the question of why any of this still matters 80 years later. I'll tell you why it matters, not as a military curiosity, not as a World War II collector's item, but as a human document. The Battle of the Bulge is one of the clearest examples in modern history of what happens when an institution, a military organization, an intelligence community, a command structure, allows its prevailing assumptions to override its reading of evidence. The failure of Allied intelligence in November and December of 1944 was not a failure of individual incompetence. It was a failure of institutional culture. The analysts who missed the warning signs were, in general, capable people doing their jobs in good faith. What they were also doing was operating inside a framework of assumptions. The Germans are finished. The Ardennes is quiet. No major offensive is coming. That made it very difficult to weigh ambiguous evidence correctly. That dynamic is not unique to 1944. It appears, with variations, in intelligence and organizational failures across every era and every field. The Ardennes is one of its clearest documented examples. That's worth understanding. The Battle of the Bulge is also one of the clearest documented examples of what individuals can accomplish when institutions fail. The commanders who decided to hold St. Vith beyond every reasonable expectation. The engineers who blew the bridges and burned the fuel dumps. The soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division, inexperienced and outgunned, who held Elsenborn Ridge in their first real battle. The artillerymen who maintained coordinated fire in freezing darkness with fragmentary communications. The medics who operated in barns. The chaplains who held Christmas services under enemy fire. None of these people changed the outcome of the war by themselves. But together, in the specific choices they made, in the specific moments they faced, they changed the outcome of this battle, and this battle changed the outcome of the war. The connection between individual human decision and large-scale historical outcome is rarely as traceable as it is in the Ardennes. That is why historians keep coming back to it. That is why you're still here. One last thing before we begin. This is a long-form documentary. It is designed to be listened to, across multiple sessions if you like, at whatever pace works for you. It is calm enough to accompany sleep, because the narration is steady, and the pace is unhurried, and the intent is never to jolt you awake with artificial drama. But it is not smooth. It is not algorithmically optimized. It contains technical data and historiographical debates and moments of deliberate friction that prove a human mind organized this specific information in this specific sequence for specific reasons. There will be moments when I tell you that historians disagree, and I'll tell you what they disagree about, and I won't pretend the disagreement is resolved when it isn't. There will be moments when the human cost of the battle asks to be felt rather than simply noted, and I will ask you to feel it rather than rush past it. That's not sentimentality, that's accuracy. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle and wake up needing to rewind, that's perfect. That's what this is for. If you stay awake through all 15 chapters, then you will know, truly know, not just the outline, but the texture and the truth of one of the most consequential 90 days in the history of the modern world. Now, if this kind of long-form, deeply researched storytelling matters to you, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who loves history. This channel exists because people who care about real, careful human history keep it alive. Your support, a comment, a share, a subscription, is what makes it possible to keep doing this work at this level. The date is the 16th of December, 1944. The fog is thick. The Ardennes is quiet. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Ghost Front. Autumn 1944 and the illusion of German collapse. There's a phrase that appears again and again in the memoirs and after-action reports from the autumn of 1944, and it should make us uncomfortable every time we read it. The phrase is, "The Germans are finished." Senior Allied commanders used it. Intelligence officers wrote it into their assessments. Soldiers wrote it home in letters. And it wasn't an unreasonable thing to believe, honestly, because looked at from a distance, the Allied position in the autumn of that year was extraordinary. Paris had been liberated. The Germans had retreated from France in what looked, from the outside, like a rout. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, the concrete and steel defensive barrier that Hitler had spent years building along the German border, was being probed and battered by American divisions who had crossed the Rhine and were looking, some of them, at Germany itself on the horizon. You could be forgiven for thinking the thing was nearly done. I want to sit with that context for a moment, because it matters enormously to what comes next. The Allied armies in the autumn of 1944 were not complacent out of laziness or stupidity. They were complacent because the evidence, taken superficially, supported complacency. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, told Eisenhower's chief of staff in October that he would actually welcome a German counterattack, that the Allies could destroy more Germans with less effort if the enemy came out into the open. That's a remarkable thing to say, and Bradley was not a foolish man. But it tells you everything about the mental atmosphere in Allied headquarters that autumn. The idea that the Germans had the capability, the fuel, the men, or the will for a major offensive was simply not being taken seriously at the highest levels. The stretch of front line that would soon become the most consequential piece of real estate in the Western War was, in November and December of 1944, called the Ghost Front. It ran through the Ardennes, a region of heavily forested hills and deep river valleys, straddling Belgium and Luxembourg, and it was held by an almost absurdly thin American line. When the German attack came on the 16th of December, that stretch of roughly 80 miles was defended by approximately 80,000 American troops in 4 divisions. Some of those divisions were fresh, inexperienced units being blooded in what their commanders considered a quiet sector. Others were battered, exhausted outfits pulled out of harder fighting further north to rest and refit in what should have been a peaceful posting. The Ardennes, in other words, was a convalescent ward and a training ground simultaneously, which tells you how little anyone expected it to become the center of the war. I've spent time reading the intelligence documents from this period, and what strikes me isn't the absence of warning signs. It's the presence of warning signs that nobody acted on decisively. By the 10th of December, American intelligence officers knew that 5 German divisions had left Holland for unknown destinations. They knew that 3 refitted panzer divisions had been identified between Koblenz and the Luxembourg border. They knew that new Volksgrenadier infantry formations had arrived in the Eifel, the German side of the Ardennes. A captured German soldier on the 4th of December had said outright that a big attack was being prepared, and his account was confirmed by other prisoners who gave the same timeline: an attack the week before Christmas. American cryptologists had even broken the Japanese diplomatic code and learned that Hitler himself had told Tokyo's ambassador that he was planning a large-scale offensive in the West. And yet the intelligence community hesitated. Brigadier General Edwin Siebert, Bradley's intelligence chief, later admitted He had noted the German capability for an Ardennes attack, but at no time did I specifically state that this capability would be implemented. There's a very human dynamic at work there. The fear, in an atmosphere of prevailing optimism, of being the person who cries wolf. Nobody wanted to be labeled a defeatist. There is a specific detail I keep returning to. Photo reconnaissance missions by American and Royal Air Force fighters had reported considerable enemy activity behind the German lines, opposite the Ghost Front. Gun emplacements, troop concentrations, road and rail movements, increased numbers of aircraft. Allied trucks bearing white stars were spotted by reconnaissance pilots, which should have raised immediate alarms about German use of captured vehicles. Around the 11th of December, a teletype message from 9th Air Force headquarters warned that the Luftwaffe had built up enough strength to make penetrations of roughly 60 miles above the Allied lines, and that such penetrations would probably be attempted within the next 2 weeks. That warning was issued 5 days before the attack began. I want you to hold that fact in your mind for a moment. 5 days. The information was there. The dots were nearly connected, and still, along the Ghost Front, American officers were hosting Friday night parties in garrison towns, and patrols were being pulled back when darkness fell. Meanwhile, on the German side of those dark trees, something extraordinary was happening. Hitler had signed an order on the 10th of November to prepare for the offensive, and what followed was, by any objective measure, a logistical miracle. Though a miracle achieved under conditions of brutal secrecy, the Reichsbahn, the German railway system, delivered more than 200,000 men, 600 tanks, and 2,000 field guns to wooded areas between Echternach and Prüm, along the northeastern front. Troop movements into assembly areas were made exclusively at night to muffle the sound of engines and tracks. Motor traffic was prohibited within 5 kilometers of the Ardennes front. Civilians of questionable heritage were evacuated from frontline areas. Officers briefed on the plan had signed oaths under penalty of death. Armies and corps changed their headquarters' code names. The level of operational security was, as one historian described it, among the tightest in military history. And it worked. By mid-December, the whole area between the Siegfried Line and the Rhine was crammed with German troops, their equipment hidden in barns and under trees, and in the cellars of farmhouses. And nobody on the other side of the line knew. There's one more thing I want to establish before we move into the German planning itself, because it's a historiographical point that matters. There is a persistent popular narrative that the Allied intelligence failure at the Ardennes was unique and total, that there were simply no warnings whatsoever. That narrative is not accurate. The warnings were there. The question is why they weren't acted upon, and the answer is a complicated mixture of institutional complacency, poor coordination between Army Group and Army intelligence staffs, and the fundamental human tendency to evidence in a way that confirms what you already believe. General Eisenhower himself acknowledged after the war that a shocking deficiency that impeded all constructive planning existed in the field of intelligence. That's not a verdict on anyone's courage or competence in the individual sense. It's a structural observation, and it's one that historians have been wrestling with ever since. I find that more interesting than the simpler story, even if the simpler story is more comfortable. On the night of the 15th of December, 1944, a thick mist hung over the snow-carpeted Ardennes. German troops were moving silently through the dark toward their assault positions, along an 80-mile front. The panzer crews and grenadiers stood at their assigned posts as their officers read a message from Field Marshal von Rundstedt. We gamble everything. Officers who had spent the previous weeks signing oaths of secrecy, moving at night, hiding their tanks in barns, were now standing in freezing darkness with that single sentence ringing in their ears. We gamble everything, whether or not they believed it would work. And most of their senior commanders didn't. They were going forward. The question was how far. At 5:30 in the morning on the 16th of December, 1944, German artillery opened fire along the Ghost Front. The ground shook. The fog muffled the sound, and the light both, turning the barrage into something felt more than seen. American soldiers who'd been sleeping in farmhouses and half-dug foxholes woke to a world that had changed overnight, though they didn't know yet how completely. For the first indication that the 110th Infantry Regiment received of the attack, it wasn't orders or intelligence or radio traffic. It was the shells themselves, exploding around them. That's how complete the surprise was. Not a warning, not a pre-dawn stand-to. Just the sound of a war resuming, larger and more dangerous than anyone had prepared for. I'll say something here that I think is important, and I want to say it clearly before we go further. What we're about to trace, the German offensive, the Allied near disaster, the extraordinary reversals that followed, is not a simple story of heroes and villains, of genius and stupidity. The men on both sides of that line were, in almost every case, doing the best they could with the information they had, the equipment they'd been given, and the orders they were following. The failure of Allied intelligence wasn't stupidity. The German offensive wasn't evil genius. History is almost never that clean. What it was, on both sides, was human. And that's exactly what makes it worth understanding. Chapter 2. Hitler's Last Gamble. The planning of Operation Wacht am Rhein. I want to start this chapter with a question that historians have been arguing about for 80 years, and I don't think anyone has fully settled it. Was the Ardennes offensive doomed from the moment Hitler conceived it? The generals who carried it out thought so, or at least the most senior among them did. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief West, was staggered when Hitler presented the plan. It was obvious to me, he said afterward, that the available forces were far too small for such an extremely ambitious plan. Field Marshal Walter Model, who would actually command Army Group B in the offensive, called it damned and said it hadn't got a leg to stand on. These weren't timid men offering polite objections. These were experienced commanders who'd spent years on both the eastern and western fronts, and they looked at what Hitler was asking for and saw something that simply didn't add up. And yet the plan went forward anyway, because that's how decisions got made in the Third Reich by the autumn of 1944. To understand the Ardennes offensive, you have to understand Hitler's strategic situation and his psychological situation in the autumn of 1944. Germany was losing. That was an objective fact. The Soviets had launched Operation Bagration in the summer, devastating Army Group Center and advancing hundreds of kilometers westward. The Allied breakout from Normandy had driven German forces back across France in what looked, from the outside, like a collapse. Italy was grinding forward. Allied bombers were pounding German cities, and crucially, German synthetic oil plants around the clock. By September, Germany's fuel production had been cut to a fraction of its earlier capacity. The war economy was under pressure that Germany had never experienced before. And yet, and this is the crucial psychological element, Hitler did not interpret all of this as evidence that the war was lost. He interpreted it as evidence that one decisive blow in the right place could still change everything. His reasoning, such as it was, ran like this. The relationship between Britain and the United States was, in his estimation, fragile, an alliance of convenience rather than genuine unity. A major German offensive that physically divided the two armies, severed their supply lines, and captured the port of Antwerp would, he believed, cause the alliance to fracture. Britain, exhausted after 5 years of war, might negotiate. America, with its democracy and its public opinion and its upcoming elections, might lose the political will to continue. If the West could be persuaded to negotiate a separate peace, even a temporary ceasefire, Germany could then turn its full military strength eastward against the Soviets, who Hitler had always regarded as the real existential enemy. It was, in strategic terms, an enormous number of ifs stacked on top of one another, each one requiring the previous one to succeed. General Eisenhower's intelligence chief put it plainly after the war. Even if the Germans had somehow reached Antwerp, there was almost no realistic scenario in which the Anglo-American alliance simply disintegrated as a result. But Hitler didn't need it to be probable. He needed it to be possible. The operational plan took shape through September and October of 1944. 3 armies would attack along a roughly 60-mile front through the Ardennes, with the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich holding the northern axis and driving toward the Meuse River and eventually Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel would advance in the center, crossing the Ourthe River and pushing west in support of Dietrich's drive. On the southern flank, the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger would anchor the attack and prevent Allied forces from rolling up the German advance from below. The plan required crossing the Meuse by the 4th day of the offensive. It required capturing Allied fuel dumps, because the Germans knew, candidly, that they didn't have enough fuel to reach Antwerp without resupply. They had stockpiled roughly 5 million gallons of fuel for the offensive, enough for approximately 6 days of operations. And that wasn't even enough to reach the Meuse, let alone Antwerp. Capturing Allied fuel was not a bonus objective, it was a prerequisite. There was a secondary operation attached to the offensive that I think is often underplayed in popular accounts. Hitler placed Otto Skorzeny, the commando who had famously rescued Mussolini, in charge of a specialized infiltration unit called Panzer Brigade 150. Skorzeny's men were to wear captured American uniforms, drive captured American vehicles, and operate behind Allied lines, causing confusion, cutting communications, changing road signs, spreading false orders, and sowing general panic. The operation, codenamed Grafe, was ambitious, but ultimately limited in its actual impact. Most of Skorzeny's men were captured without playing a significant active role in the battle. However, the rumor of the operation, once Allied intelligence became aware of it, caused a level of paranoia behind American lines that was entirely disproportionate to what Skorzeny actually achieved. For days after the offensive began, American checkpoints were stopping vehicles and quizzing drivers on American football scores and the names of movie stars, trying to identify German infiltrators. Even Eisenhower, at his headquarters in Versailles, was placed under heavy guard because of rumors, almost certainly false, that Skorzeny's men were targeting him personally. The men who would carry the offensive forward were an extraordinary mixture of the experienced and the desperately improvised. Hitler needed more manpower, and Germany was running short of it in the most fundamental way. The volunteering age had been lowered to 16, and the conscription age raised to 60. Men from the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine were transferred to the army. Workers deemed non-essential to war production were drafted. Most of these new troops were organized into Volksgrenadier divisions, economized versions of standard infantry formations, padded out with undertrained men and given reduced artillery and vehicle complements. To lead the attack, however, experienced Panzer and Vith and SS divisions were pulled from the Eastern Front. These were among the most capable formations Germany had remaining, and pulling them westward for this offensive meant weakening the Eastern Front at precisely the moment when Soviet pressure was at its most intense. General Guderian, chief of the General Staff, warned Hitler explicitly that the Soviet army was about to attack in overwhelming strength, and that Germany couldn't afford to strip the East. Hitler dismissed the warning. I want to dwell for a moment on the sheer scale of what Germany managed to assemble, because it's genuinely astonishing given the state of the German war economy by late 1944. More than 300,000 men, approximately 2,100 tanks and assault guns, around 1,900 artillery pieces. This was not a scratch force. This was a major military effort, pulled together through an act of national will and organizational improvisation that even Germany's enemies, in retrospect, found remarkable. The historian Antony Beevor has noted the logistical complexity of moving all of this into position without Allied intelligence detecting it, and it remains one of the more impressive feats of operational security in the entire war. The Germans moved at night, hid in forests, maintained strict radio silence, routed communications through landlines inside Germany, where Allied codebreakers couldn't intercept them. They had done something that, in theory, should have been impossible to do undetected. And they'd done it. There is a particular moment in the pre-offensive planning that I find almost unbearably revealing about the state of the Third Reich in those final months. On the 11th and 12th of December, army, corps, and division commanders were assembled in a large underground room for what they expected to be a strategic briefing. Instead, Hitler lectured them for more than an hour about Frederick the Great, about the history of Germany, about National Socialism and the will of the German people. He rambled. He harangued. He left the room and left his listeners with the impression, as one account describes it, of a final, desperate Wagnerian effort. None of them believed the offensive could succeed, but all were determined to carry out their orders to the best of their ability. I don't know what to do with that image, exactly. A room full of professional soldiers, many of them the finest commanders Germany had produced, sitting in an underground bunker listening to a man they privately believed was driving their country off a cliff, and then going out anyway to execute his plan. It's not a comfortable image, but it's the truth of what happened. The code name for the build-up, chosen deliberately to mislead Allied intercept operations, was Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, the title of a popular patriotic German song, chosen specifically because it implied a defensive posture rather than an offensive one. The operational code name for the attack itself was Herbstnebel, Operation Autumn Mist. The combination of the two names, one defensive and one atmospheric, says something about the character of the whole enterprise. It was a massive offensive wrapped in the disguise of defensiveness, launched under fog, depending for its success on the enemy not looking closely enough to see through the disguise. In the event, the disguise worked almost perfectly, which brings us back to the question I started with. Was it doomed from the beginning? The generals who planned it thought so. The men who launched it weren't sure, and the answer, as we'll see, arrived not in one dramatic moment, but in dozens of small ones, spread across 3 weeks of bitter fighting on roads and in forests that both sides would remember for the rest of their lives. Chapter 3. The Thin Line. American Forces in the Ardennes. December 1944, I've always thought. The most underrated element of any military history is the texture of the ordinary. The physical condition of the men involved, the state of their equipment, the quality of their sleep, the contents of their last meal. The broad strategic picture tells you what decisions were made at headquarters. The texture of the ordinary tells you what it actually felt like to be in the middle of it. And in the Ardennes, in December of 1944, the texture of the ordinary was, for the American soldiers defending the Ghost Front, a specific mixture of exhaustion, cold, and a boredom that they would have traded anything to have back. The Ardennes sector in early December was, by design, the quietest part of the American line. It was held by the 8th Corps under Major General Troy Middleton, a capable and experienced officer who had been assigned one of the most difficult administrative tasks in the theatre. Holding a long, thinly stretched front with too few men, using that front simultaneously as a rest area for battle-worn divisions and a training area for new ones. The divisions he had were not, in the main, in peak condition. The 28th Infantry Division had been badly mauled in the Hurtgen Forest fighting, one of the costliest and least well-remembered American campaigns of the entire war, and had been sent to the Ardennes to recover. The 4th Infantry Division was similarly battered. The 106th Infantry Division, by contrast, was fresh, newly arrived from the United States, its men green and untested, sent to the Ardennes precisely because it was supposed to be quiet. That mix, broken down veterans and raw newcomers, is not a formula for an effective defense. I want to spend a moment on the Hurtgen Forest because it matters to the story in ways that aren't always fully explained. The Hurtgen, a dense, dark stretch of forest along the German-Belgian border, had been the scene of grinding, costly American attacks from September through December of 1944. It was fighting of a particularly brutal kind, close range, infantry heavy, in terrain that negated most of the advantages that American firepower and mobility normally provided. Divisions went in and came out decimated. The strategic rationale for the campaign has been questioned by historians ever since. But the relevant point here is that the veterans who'd survived the Hurtgen and been sent to the Ardennes to rest were not simply tired. They were, in many cases, deeply shaken. Men who had seen things in those trees that left marks, that don't show up on divisional strength returns. Sending them to the quiet sector was the right instinct. The problem was that the quiet sector was about to become the most dangerous place in Europe. The physical conditions facing American soldiers in the Ardennes that December deserve careful attention because they would shape the battle as much as any tactical decision made at headquarters level. The winter of 1944 to 45 was one of the coldest on record in the region, with average temperatures falling to roughly -7 degrees Celsius, and during the worst periods, significantly colder than that. Many American soldiers were still wearing cotton field jackets rather than proper winter gear. Some units had only their summer weight uniforms. Veterans of the battle remember it primarily in terms of cold. A cold that was not merely uncomfortable but operationally dangerous. A cold that cracked rifle bolts, froze engine blocks, and caused frostbite at a rate that military medical planners had not adequately prepared for. Louis Jack Baldwin, an Army Ranger who fought in the Ardennes, said simply, "Cold. It was so cold that if you got wet, you couldn't get dry." That sentence, in its plainness, conveys something that pages of statistical data about temperature ranges cannot. The foxholes of the Ardennes are one of the defining images of the battle, and I want to be precise about what that meant in practice. A foxhole in frozen ground is an enormously difficult thing to dig. The earth resists a shovel the way concrete does, and in the forests of the Ardennes, the roots of fir trees made the digging even harder. Men who managed to dig in then faced the problem of tree-burst artillery, shells that detonated in the branches overhead rather than in the ground, sending shrapnel downward into the foxholes that were supposed to protect the men from direct fire. The double threat, the killing cold above ground and the lethal overhead fragmentation below the tree canopy, meant that there was no truly safe position in the forest. You were always exposed to something. Jim Sharp, an infantryman from the period who was interviewed decades later at the age of 101, remembered sleeping in foxholes and going out on patrols both day and night. Besides the cold, he said, it was dangerous business being in the infantry on the front lines. The supply situation along the Ghost Front was adequate for a quiet sector, and completely inadequate for what was about to happen. The road network in the Ardennes was and remains poor by Western European standards. A series of narrow, winding roads through the hills and forests, with few major highways and many routes that could only accommodate one vehicle at a time in each direction. The towns of Bastogne and St. Vith sat at critical road junctions, and their importance was a function not of their size or strategic significance in the abstract, but of this specific geographical reality. In the Ardennes, whoever held the road junctions controlled the movement of armies. The American commanders who'd been stationed in the area understood this at some level. It was one reason why St. Vith had a significant command presence. But the preparations for defending those junctions against a major armoured assault were essentially non-existent because nobody at the corps or army group level was planning for a major armoured assault. There is a figure from this period that I keep returning to because it captures the asymmetry of what was about to happen more starkly than almost any other. When the German offensive began on the 16th of December, it struck an American force of approximately 80,000 men along that 80-mile front. The attacking German force numbered more than 200,000 troops, with approximately 1,000 tanks and assault guns. Those numbers don't tell the whole story. The terrain worked against the attackers, and the American units, even the battered and the green ones, were not passive. But they do establish the fundamental shock of the first days. American units that should, by rights, have been swept aside by that disparity weren't. And the reasons why they weren't constitute some of the most important history of the entire battle. One of those reasons was the American soldiers' instinctive relationship with ground. The officers and NCOs of the American Army in the autumn of 1944 were, in general, practical men with a practical approach to terrain. Men who looked at a hill or a tree line or a road junction and thought about fields of fire and supply routes before they thought about anything else. That instinct applied along the road junctions of the Ardennes from the first hours of the German attack bought time that the Allied High Command needed desperately. Captain Frederick Fiker of K Company, 110th Infantry, had been sending out daytime patrols along the main road connecting St. Vith and Luxembourg in the days before the attack, because he had, as one account describes it, a gnawing feeling that something was not quite right. He couldn't have told you what that feeling was based on, exactly, but he was right, and the fact that he acted on it, even in the absence of specific intelligence, is the kind of thing that makes the difference between a position that holds and one that doesn't. The night of the 15th of December was, by most accounts, cold and quiet, with a thick mist over the hills. Men along the ghost front who weren't on watch were sleeping, playing cards, writing letters. Some were attending parties in the rear. The war in the Ardennes seemed to be waiting for something. None of them knew yet what that something was. Though a few of the older ones, the ones who'd been in the army long enough to learn that the quietest stretches of line were sometimes the most dangerous, were perhaps not quite as relaxed as they appeared. The question of who knew what and when and what they did with that knowledge is one that historians have been arguing about ever since. But the individual soldier along the ghost front on that last quiet night didn't have access to the intelligence debates happening at Corps and Army Group headquarters. He had the cold and the dark and the mist and whatever sense of unease or settled calm his own experience had given him. And he had roughly 6 hours left before the shells arrived. Chapter 4, Wacht am Rhein, the 16th of December, and the opening of the assault, 5:30 in the morning. The 15th has just turned into the 16th. The Ardennes is black and quiet. Then, all at once, it wasn't quiet anymore. The German artillery barrage that opened the Ardennes offensive on the morning of the 16th of December 1944, lasted roughly 90 minutes. Along an 80-mile front, German 88mm guns, artillery pieces, rocket launchers, and mortars fired simultaneously, concentrating on known American positions, road junctions, and command posts. The noise would have been, to the men on the receiving end, something beyond the ordinary experience of combat. A continuous physical roar that didn't rise and fall, but simply persisted, as if the air itself had changed composition. The fog and the darkness amplified the disorientation. There was no way to see where the fire was coming from, no way to identify concentrations or predict where the next round would land. You could only wait for it to stop and hope you were still there when it did. When more than 200,000 German troops advanced out of the tree line after that barrage, the scale of what the American units on the line were facing took time to comprehend. The first reports coming back through the American chain of command were fragmentary, confused, and in several cases flatly contradictory. Units that had been hit hard were reporting massive German formations. Other units that had been less directly struck were reporting nothing unusual. The fog and the smoke from the barrage reduced visibility to almost nothing in places, meaning that local commanders were trying to piece together a coherent picture of a developing battle from the accounts of men who could literally not see beyond 100 meters in any direction. It took hours, in some cases a full day, for the American command at corps and army group level to understand that this wasn't a local attack or a German spoiling operation. This was something else entirely. I want to walk through what happened in the opening hours on each of the three major German axes, because the differences between them are important and are often lost in the popular narrative that reduces the entire first day to a general catastrophe. In the north, the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich drove toward the vital high ground at Elsenborn Ridge, which controlled the northern approaches to the Meuse and was the key terrain feature on that axis of advance. The 99th Infantry Division, a green unit that had only recently arrived in the sector, faced Dietrich's assault directly. It's the kind of situation that, in theory, should have resulted in a quick German breakthrough. What actually happened is one of the more remarkable stories of the entire battle. The 99th, despite being inexperienced, despite being outnumbered, and despite the shock of the assault, held its position at Elsenborn Ridge. The northern attack did not break through on the first day, or the second, or the third, and that failure, which received relatively little attention in the immediate aftermath of the battle, overshadowed by the more dramatic events further south, was one of the critical factors in the eventual Allied recovery. In the centre, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel had a different kind of success. Manteuffel was, by most assessments, the most capable of the three German army commanders in the offensive, a small, precise, technically gifted officer who had made a reputation on the Eastern Front. His army hit the 28th Infantry Division, which, as I mentioned earlier, was still recovering from the Hurtgen Forest. The 28th fought hard, but it fought in fragments, isolated battalions holding crossroads towns against German armoured columns that simply went around them, leaving pockets of American resistance behind the advancing German lines. The small town of Clairvaux, where one of the 28th regiments was headquartered in a medieval castle, became the scene of a defence that lasted longer than it had any right to against the weight of the German attack. But the castle fell, and with its fall, the road to Bastogne was open. The 106th Infantry Division, the green unit in the Schnee Eifel area near St. Vith, suffered the most catastrophic outcome of the opening day. Two of its regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd, were surrounded by German units advancing on either side of their positions. and found themselves cut off almost immediately. In the confusion of the first day, with communication lines cut and roads under German control, the regiments had essentially lost contact with their own division headquarters. What followed over the next several days was one of the more painful episodes in American military history. Not because the men failed in any obvious tactical sense, but because they were placed in an impossible position by a strategic situation that gave them no good options. By the 19th of December, approximately 8,000 American soldiers from the 106th Division would surrender, the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theatre since the Patton campaign in the Pacific. The town of St. Vith sits at the intersection of major roads in the Belgian Ardennes, and its tactical importance was immediately recognized on both sides. The German timetable required St. Vith to be captured by the second day of the offensive, the 17th of December. The Americans scrambled to reinforce it with elements of the 7th Armored Division and other units, and what followed was a defense that lasted 5 full days beyond the German schedule. 5 days. In a battle where the German plan depended on strict adherence to a timetable. Reach the Meuse by the 4th day, capture the fuel dumps, maintain the momentum before Allied reinforcements could arrive. Every extra day that St. Vith held was a day that the German operational schedule fell further behind. I want to be precise about this, because it's easy to hear St. Vith held for 5 extra days and think of it as a footnote. It wasn't a footnote. It was one of the pivots around which the entire battle turned. One of the more troubling aspects of the first day was a series of events near the Belgian town of Malmedy, where soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division's Kampfgruppe Piper were advancing along the northern road axis. This is an area of the battle's history where the documentary record is clear and where I want to be precise. American prisoners of war and Belgian civilians in several locations in the path of Piper's advance were murdered. The most documented instance occurred in a field near Malmedy, where American prisoners were shot. These murders were not isolated incidents in the fog of tactical combat. They were committed against men who had already been captured and posed no immediate threat. The Malmedy massacre, as it became known, was investigated after the war and resulted in criminal proceedings, though the ultimate sentences handed down were reduced and became the subject of considerable legal and political controversy in the post-war years. I mention it not to dwell on it, but because it is part of the documented historical record of what happened on the 16th of December and the days immediately following, and a history that elides. It is not a complete history. By nightfall on the 16th of December, the German attack had achieved its primary strategic objective, surprise. The Allied line in the Ardennes had been struck hard, bent at multiple points, and was in various states of confusion along its entire length. But, and this is the critical qualification, it had not broken. Not completely, not yet. The northern shoulder at Elsenborn held. St. Vith, against the timetable, held. Individual pockets of American resistance were scattered throughout the area. The German armoured columns were supposedly rolling through, and those pockets were fighting. The German advance was not the clean, rapid, timetable-driven thrust that the plan demanded. It was already, on day one, something messier, something slower, and slower, in this particular battle, was the beginning of the end for the German hope. At Allied headquarters, the scale of the crisis was taking time to register. Eisenhower, at his headquarters in Versailles, received the first fragmentary reports during the day and made an initial assessment that this was a significant German attack requiring a significant response. He didn't yet know quite how significant, but he did something on that first day that in retrospect was one of the more consequential decisions of the entire battle. He ordered the 1st and 10th Armoured Divisions and 2 airborne divisions that had been resting in reserve to move toward the Ardennes. The airborne divisions he ordered forward were the 82nd and the 101st. They were in Reims, roughly 160 kilometers from the front. They would be needed. Chapter 5. The Road to Bastogne. Movement, fog, and the race that decided everything. There is a specific kind of chaos that occurs when a front collapses unexpectedly. Not a sudden annihilation, but a dissolution, a gradual unraveling of the coherent picture that headquarters staffs depend on, replaced by a flood of contradictory reports, rumor, and the visible evidence of men moving backward. In the days after the 16th of December, the roads of the Belgian and Luxembourg Ardennes carried this kind of chaos westward. Soldiers who had been cut off from their units, drivers who had lost their convoys, headquarters elements that had packed up and moved when the German shells got too close. All of them were moving west, and the roads were clogged. Into this westward flow, 2 American formations were moving in the opposite direction. The 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division had been resting and refitting in the French city of Reims when the attack began. They were paratroopers, light infantry, without the heavy weapons and vehicles of regular divisions, trained for rapid deployment by air into contested territory. They were also, in December of 1944, without much of their winter equipment, because the assumption had been that they would be used in a future airborne operation, not in a ground defensive battle in the middle of a Belgian winter. They mounted trucks and half-tracks and began moving north against the tide of retreat toward the sound of a battle that nobody yet fully understood. The contrast is worth sitting with. 2 columns of trucks moving northeast through the dark, passing other vehicles moving southwest, and the men in those trucks looking at each other as they passed, and knowing, or half knowing, what the difference was. Bastogne was the objective, or at least it was the immediate objective. The place that, more than any other single location in the opening phase of the battle, would define what the battle became. It was a small Belgian market town, of no particular fame or strategic importance before December of 1944. What it had was roads. 7 major roads converged on Bastogne, which in the Ardennes, given the terrain and the density of the forest, made it the kind of place that you couldn't conduct a major armored operation across the region without controlling. The Germans knew this, the Americans knew this, and the race to Bastogne, a race that began more or less simultaneously with the German advance and the American response, was the race that shaped everything that followed. The 101st Airborne Division arrived in Bastogne on the 19th of December. They arrived with whatever they'd had in Reims, short of winter clothing, short of ammunition in some units, without the artillery and armour that a regular division would have brought. They were met by a scene of considerable disorder. Retreating soldiers, abandoned vehicles, the accumulated friction of a front that had been surprised and was trying to reconstitute itself. The division's acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, since Major General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington at the time, set about turning the town into a defensive position. Elements of the 10th Armored Division were already there, and together they began the work of organizing a perimeter, identifying fields of fire, positioning what artillery they had, and preparing for what they correctly anticipated was coming. The German formations surrounding Bastogne were not moving with the deliberate, methodical certainty that the stereotype of German military efficiency might suggest. They were moving fast, faster in some places than their own supply lines could keep up with, and the decision to bypass Bastogne rather than take it immediately was a calculated gamble. The town sat astride roads that Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army needed for its westward drive. But reducing a defended town costs time and men, and the German timetable didn't allow for either. So the panzers went around, and behind them, German infantry divisions moved up to contain the American garrisons that had, almost overnight, established itself in the middle of German-controlled territory. By the 21st of December, Bastogne was encircled. The Americans inside the perimeter were surrounded on all sides by German forces, running low on food and ammunition and medical supplies. In temperatures well below freezing, without adequate winter clothing, and without any immediate prospect of relief. By any objective military calculation, they were in a desperate situation. I want to establish something about the Bastogne garrison that tends to get compressed in popular retellings. The defense of Bastogne wasn't conducted by the 101st Airborne Division alone, though the paratroopers have, understandably, received most of the historical attention. Elements of the 10th Armored Division, the 73rd Armored Field Artillery Battalion, Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division, and various other units that happened to be in or near Bastogne when the German advance cut the roads were all part of the defense. Engineers who'd been doing road work became riflemen. Artillerymen found themselves fighting as infantry. The division's quartermaster units were pressed into service at the perimeter. It was an improvised defense, and the improvisation, the ability to take whatever was at hand and make it into something coherent, is itself a reflection of what the American army had become by late 1944. It wasn't tidy, but it worked. The situation inside Bastogne in the days before Christmas was, by the accounts of the men who were there, relentless in its pressure and its physical misery. The temperature was brutal. Ammunition was being rationed. Artillery batteries were restricted to a specific number of rounds per gun per day, a restriction that was felt acutely every time German attacks came in. The medical situation was grim. The division's medical officer and most of his staff, along with the bulk of the medical supplies, had been captured by the Germans early in the fighting. The surgeons who remained were operating in conditions that belonged to a much earlier century of warfare, without adequate anesthetics, without adequate blood plasma, without adequate heat. The soldiers dug their foxholes in the frozen ground and waited and fought and dug and waited again. A veteran named Louis Locker described it this way: "We didn't have ammunition, food, or anything. We were going into the mortuary to take clothing and boots off our dead GIs to stay warm. That is as far from a triumphant narrative as it is possible to get. And I think it's important to hold on to it, alongside the famous moments of defiance, because it's the truer picture." On the 22nd of December, the Germans offered the garrison a way out. Under a flag of truce, German officers approached the American lines with a formal written demand for the honorable surrender of Bastogne to be given within 2 hours, or the town would face total annihilation. The demand was delivered to General McAuliffe, who read it and reportedly said, "Oh, nuts." His staff, recognizing that his immediate reaction was probably the best possible response, suggested he use it as his official reply. McAuliffe wrote out a formal note to the German commander. NUTS, the American commander. When German officers received the note and didn't understand the American colloquialism, an American officer explained, "It means the same thing as go to hell." I want to be careful here about how I frame this moment, because there's a risk of it becoming a cartoon, a punchline that flattens the genuine danger and the genuine suffering of the men inside that perimeter. McAuliffe's reply was defiant, and the defiance was real, and it mattered enormously to the men he commanded. But Bastogne on the 22nd of December was not a moment of breezy confidence. It was a moment of genuine desperation met with genuine resolve. And the distance between those two things is where the real human story lives. The weather over the Ardennes during the first week of the German offensive had been consistently miserable. Overcast, foggy, with low cloud ceilings that kept Allied aircraft on the ground. This was not an accident. The Germans had specifically timed the offensive to take advantage of the winter weather patterns in the region. Knowing that Allied air superiority was one of the key Allied advantages that the offensive would need to neutralize. For the first 7 or 8 days, the weather delivered exactly what the Germans needed. But weather in the Ardennes in December is not stable, and the forecasters on both sides were watching the same data. On the 23rd of December, the skies began to clear, and when they cleared, the entire calculus of the battle shifted. Chapter 6: Clear Skies and Crisis. Air power, Patton's turn, and the shape of the battle changes. On the 23rd of December 1944, the weather broke. I want to describe what that meant in practical terms, because it was not simply a meteorological event. It was a shift in the fundamental nature of the battle. For the previous week, the Allied air forces had been effectively blind and effectively grounded. The cloud ceilings were too low, the visibility too poor, for the kind of tactical air support that American and British ground forces had come to depend on as a routine feature of their operations. German armoured columns had been moving on roads that, in good weather, would have been death traps, open to attack from P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons that could destroy tanks and trucks at will. In the bad weather, those columns moved freely. German supply convoys, which were already struggling with the road network and the traffic jams caused by the narrow Ardennes roads, at least didn't have to worry about aircraft appearing out of the overcast and turning them into burning wreckage. When the skies cleared on the 23rd, all of that changed. Allied fighter bombers and medium bombers began attacking German armoured columns, supply routes, road junctions, and troop concentrations throughout the salient. The German columns that had been inching westward in relative safety were suddenly exposed on roads that offered no cover. The fields on either side were frozen open ground, the forests too close to the road for vehicles to shelter in quickly. The effect on German logistics, which were already under severe strain, was immediate and significant. Fuel that had been moving forward, and the fuel situation was already critical, given the Germans' failure to capture Allied fuel dumps, was now even harder to move. Repair vehicles couldn't reach damaged tanks on exposed roads. The westbound momentum of the advance, which had already slowed considerably as the road junctions at St. Vith and Bastogne created bottlenecks, slowed further still. The clear weather also meant that the besieged garrison in Bastogne could be supplied from the air. On the 23rd, American transport aircraft, C-47s primarily, began dropping supplies to the encircled defenders. The drops were imprecise by modern standards. A significant percentage of the supply containers landed outside the perimeter and had to be either retrieved under fire or abandoned. But the drops brought ammunition, food, and medical supplies at a moment when all three were critically short, and the psychological effect on the garrison, the visible proof that they had not been forgotten, that the air above them was Allied air, was perhaps as important as the material content of the bundles. The airborne soldiers who watched those aircraft coming in through the cold blue sky of the 23rd of December had been surrounded and under constant pressure for 4 days. Those aircraft mattered to them. 300 kilometers to the south, something was happening that would, within days, resolve the immediate crisis at Bastogne, but which, at the moment it began, represented one of the more remarkable feats of military logistics and command decision of the entire Western War. General George Patton's Third Army had, at the beginning of December, been preparing to attack eastward into the Saar region of Germany, a planned offensive to push through the Siegfried Line in the south. On the 19th of December, Eisenhower convened a senior commanders' conference at Verdun, a choice of location with its own grim historical resonance, and made the decision that the Allied effort needed to pivot. The Ardennes had to be the priority. Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly he could attack northward to relieve Bastogne. Patton said he could attack in 48 hours with 3 divisions. The room, according to accounts of that meeting, went quiet. Turning an army, not just stopping an advance, but reversing it, redirecting it 90 degrees along a different axis in winter, over roads already congested with the traffic of retreat and reinforcement, in 48 hours was not something that military planning doctrine would normally consider feasible. Armies take days, sometimes weeks, to shift their axes of advance, even in favorable conditions. Patton was proposing to do it in 2 days, in the middle of a Belgian winter, with his supply lines already stretched. The skepticism was understandable. Patton pulled it off. On the 22nd of December, the Third Army began its northward attack. On the 26th of December, elements of the 4th Armoured Division broke through the German encirclement south of Bastogne and reopened the road into the town. The siege was broken. I want to be precise about what that meant and what it didn't mean, because the popular narrative sometimes compresses these events into a single triumphant moment that obscures the harder truth. The relief of Bastogne on the 26th of December did not end the Battle of the Bulge. It didn't even end the fighting around Bastogne. German forces continued to pressure the town and the corridor into it for weeks afterward. What it did was prevent the worst possible outcome: the complete reduction of the garrison and the loss of the road junction to German control. It meant that the Bulge was contained, not eliminated, but contained at its southern end, and containing the Bulge at one end, while the northern shoulder at Elsenborn had already held, was the beginning of the shape that would ultimately define the outcome. The Bulge was a bulge, not a breakthrough, and a bulge, by definition, is something that can be pressed back. The strategic picture at the end of December 1944 was, from the German perspective, almost uniformly grim, though it wasn't yet fully visible in those terms from inside the German command structure. The 6th SS Panzer Army in the north had never broken through at Elsenborn Ridge and was now facing Allied pressure from multiple directions. The 5th Panzer Army's lead elements had reached the vicinity of Selles in Belgium, within roughly 6 kilometers of the Meuse River, the closest any German unit would come to the river during the entire offensive, but they reached it without fuel. The lead panzer elements of the 2nd Panzer Division sat within sight of their objective, immobilized, their tanks empty, unable to go forward, and unable to be resupplied because the roads behind them were either jammed with traffic or under Allied air attack. It was the precise failure that the German generals had predicted. The fuel not captured, the timetable not met, the battle turning into exactly the attritional slog that Germany couldn't win. The Meuse was never crossed, not by a single German tank. On the 1st of January 1945, the German Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, an all-out attempt to regain at least temporary air superiority over the Ardennes by attacking Allied air bases in the northwest simultaneously. The operation succeeded in destroying roughly 300 Allied aircraft on the ground. It also cost the Luftwaffe more than 200 irreplaceable, experienced pilots, men who couldn't be replaced, in the training programs that German fuel shortages had effectively gutted. The Luftwaffe gained nothing lasting from Bodenplatte and lost something it couldn't afford to lose. It was, in miniature, the story of the whole offensive, a tactical success that masked a strategic disaster. Chapter 7: The Bulge at its widest, German overextension, and the first cracks in the offensive. By the last days of December 1944, the German Ardennes offensive had reached the physical limits of what it could achieve. The Bulge, that westward protrusion of German-held territory driven into the Allied line, was at its maximum extent, and even inside the German command structure, the men responsible for the offensive were beginning to confront a reality that their earlier optimism had deferred rather than resolved. The 2nd Panzer Division's lead elements sat immobilized near Celles, within roughly 6 kilometers of the Meuse, their tanks dry of fuel. The roads behind them were blocked, partly by Allied air attack, partly by the accumulated disorder of an advance that had outrun its own supply lines. The gap between what the offensive had promised and what it had delivered was widening with every passing hour, and the German commanders knew it, even if their orders from above hadn't yet formally acknowledged it. I want to establish a geographical picture here, because the shape of the bulge at its maximum extent is important to understanding why German overextension was structural rather than incidental. At its deepest point, the salient pushed roughly 80 kilometers west into Allied-held territory. A dramatic penetration, but one that was shaped like a blunt wedge rather than a clean breakthrough. The northern edge of the salient was anchored by the failure at Elsenborn Ridge, which meant the Germans had never been able to roll up the flank the way the original plan required. The southern edge was contested by Patton's northward advance. The western tip, near Celles and Dinant, was isolated and unsupplied. What this meant, practically, was that the Germans had created a salient with a narrow neck and wide shoulders, and narrow-necked salients are inherently vulnerable to being cut off. Every German officer who studied a map in the last week of December could see the shape. The question was whether Hitler would acknowledge what the shape meant. Hitler, characteristically, did not immediately acknowledge it. His orders to the commanders in the field, throughout the final days of December, continued to insist on offensive action, continued to demand the drive to the Meuse, continued to dismiss the developing Allied counterattack as a temporary problem to be overcome by willpower. Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, was trying to manage the impossible gap between the orders coming from above and the physical reality he could see from his command post. Model was, by the accounts of the officers who served under him, a man of formidable energy and intelligence, someone who had made his reputation on the Eastern Front precisely by managing impossible situations. And even he was struggling. He had begun quietly preparing contingency plans for a withdrawal from the salient, plans he couldn't formally present to Hitler without risking his command, but plans that reality was making more urgent by the day. The tension between what headquarters demanded and what the ground would actually allow is one of the defining themes of the final phase, the offensive. The fuel problem, which had been structural from the beginning, had by now become catastrophic. The German operational plan had anticipated capturing substantial Allied fuel dumps in the initial advance. There were large American supply depots in the Ardennes region, and the panzers were supposed to refuel from captured stocks. They didn't, for 2 reasons. First, American quartermasters, in some cases displaying extraordinary initiative under pressure, moved or destroyed fuel stocks before the German advance could reach them. In the confusion of the first days, with German armored columns advancing faster than many American headquarters could track, the decision to deny the fuel rather than preserve it required men at relatively low levels of command to make high-stakes decisions quickly and correctly. Many of them did. Second, the American resistance at road junctions like St. Vith and Bastogne had slowed the German advance enough that the timetable for reaching the fuel dumps fell apart. By the time some German units reached positions from which the dumps might have been accessible, Allied forces had already secured or destroyed the relevant stocks. The panzers ran dry, not because of bad luck, but because of the compounding effect of American resistance and German timetable failure. What the lead German units were experiencing by late December was a kind of tactical limbo that is difficult to convey in summary, but is thoroughly documented in the after-action accounts. Too far forward to be adequately supplied, too far from their start lines to fall back without losing significant equipment, and facing a hardening American resistance that was growing stronger as Allied reinforcements flowed into the area. Sergeant Donald Nichols of the 2nd Panzer Division, whose unit had reached the westernmost point of the advance, later described the situation simply. The men were cold, they hadn't eaten properly in days, the tanks were out of fuel, and they were sitting in a Belgian field watching American fighter bombers work over the road behind them. There was nothing to do but wait, and waiting felt like losing, which is what it was. The documents from this period, the logistical reports, the divisional diaries, the communications between army and corps headquarters, show a German army that was not broken but was being slowly, inexorably ground down by the accumulated weight of a plan that had asked too much of the men and machines required to execute it. Allied reinforcements, meanwhile, were flowing into the Ardennes at a rate that the German planning had never adequately accounted for. By the last week of December, Eisenhower had committed approximately 600,000 men to the battle, the largest single concentration of American ground forces in any engagement of the entire war. Fresh divisions were arriving from the west and southwest. The 82nd Airborne, having played a crucial role in holding the northern shoulder, was being reinforced by armored and infantry units. On the southern face of the salient, Patton's Third Army was fighting a grinding northward advance that was tying down German forces needed elsewhere. The sheer weight of Allied manpower and materiel, the industrial output of a continent that had been preparing for this war for years, was beginning to make itself felt in a way that no amount of German determination could offset. This was, in the end, the deepest truth of the Ardennes offensive. It was an attempt to fight the kind of war that industrial and human resources decide, and on those terms, Germany had already lost before the first gun fired. There is a particular detail from this period that I find cuts through the strategic analysis and lands somewhere closer to the human reality. Captured German soldiers in the last days of December were, by the accounts of American intelligence officers who debriefed them, often surprised. Not surprised to be captured, though some were. Surprised at the sheer volume of American equipment they encountered. One German officer, captured near Rochefort, reportedly told his interrogators that he had been told the Americans were running out of fuel and ammunition, that the Allies were on the verge of collapse, that one more push would break them. Instead, he said, every road he'd seen was full of American trucks moving forward. The disconnect between what German soldiers had been told and what they actually saw is one of the more revealing documents of the final phase of the offensive. Not because it reflects poorly on individual German soldiers, but because it illustrates how comprehensively the German High Command had insulated itself from an accurate picture of Allied strength. The propaganda they'd fed their troops had by this point become the only reality they could offer. The clearing weather that had begun on the 23rd of December continued through the final days of the month, and its effect on the battle was cumulative and decisive. Allied air forces flew thousands of sorties over the salient, attacking German armoured columns, supply lines, rail junctions, and troop concentrations with a persistence that the Luftwaffe, after the losses of Bodenplatte, was completely unable to contest. The Typhoons of the Royal Air Force's 2nd Tactical Air Force and the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force became a constant presence over German-held territory in the salient, and the effect on German morale, on top of everything else, was significant. A soldier in a foxhole who can hear aircraft overhead that he knows aren't his, is fighting two battles simultaneously. One against the enemy in front of him, and one against the knowledge that the sky belongs to someone else. By the end of December, the German soldiers in the salient were fighting both of those battles, and losing both. As the calendar turned to 1945, the shape of the battle had fundamentally changed. The Germans were no longer advancing. They were defending, trying to hold a salient that was costing them men and equipment every day while offering no prospect of further strategic gain. The Allied question was no longer whether to stop the offensive, but how quickly and at what cost to push it back. Eisenhower's plan was methodical. A coordinated attack from both north and south, designed to compress the salient and eventually cut it off at the base, destroying the forces inside it. Some of his subordinates, Patton most vocally, felt this was too cautious, that a faster, more aggressive attack might cut the salient off completely and achieve a decisive encirclement. The debate between methodical compression and aggressive encirclement would persist through the entire Allied counteroffensive, and its resolution, in favor of the more methodical approach, shaped the final outcome of the battle in ways that historians have been arguing about ever since. One of the most honest assessments of where the battle stood at the turn of the year came from a German source rather than an Allied one. General Hasso von Manteuffel, whose 5th Panzer Army had achieved the deepest penetration of the offensive, wrote later that by the 1st of January, it was clear that the offensive had failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. The Meuse had not been crossed. Antwerp was not threatened. The Allied alliance had not fractured. What the offensive had achieved was a salient, a temporary bulge in the Allied line, that now had to be defended at ruinous cost while the Allies massed their forces to eliminate it. Manteuffel was too professional a soldier to blame the failure entirely on Hitler's unrealistic objectives, though he clearly believed the plan had been fundamentally flawed from the start. What he acknowledged, in the careful language of a memoir written years after the fact, was that the battle had been decided not in the first days of dramatic advance, but in the accumulated, grinding days of resistance at road junctions and frozen ridge lines. The days when American soldiers who weren't supposed to hold, held anyway. Chapter 8. Elsenborn Ridge. The stand that history almost forgot. There's a piece of high ground in eastern Belgium that I think deserves more attention than it typically gets in popular accounts of the Bulge. Elsenborn Ridge, a long, gently elevated stretch of terrain overlooking the Auer and Amblieve river valleys, was, in military terms, the key to the northern shoulder of the entire salient. If the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich had broken through at Elsenborn, the northern road network would have opened up, and the German drive toward the Meuse and Antwerp would have had the arterial highway it needed. The town of Liège, with its enormous Allied supply depots, would have been directly threatened. The whole northern architecture of the Allied line in that sector would have unraveled. Elsenborn held, and because it held, none of those things happened. But the story of how it held, and at what cost, is one that tends to get compressed into a single sentence in histories that are more interested in the dramatic events at Bastogne. The divisions that held Elsenborn Ridge were the 1st Infantry Division, the storied Big Red one of the most experienced American divisions in the theatre, and the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, the latter of which was still, in the opening days of December, essentially untested. The 99th had arrived in Europe in November of 1944, and had been placed in what was supposed to be a quiet sector specifically to allow it to adjust to combat conditions gradually, to learn the practical lessons of the front without the burden of a major engagement. The Germans attacked it instead. On the first day of the offensive, 9th Army Corps, part of Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, struck the 99th positions in the Losheim Gap, with multiple divisions of Volksgrenadiers and SS infantry. The gap between what the 99th's men had been trained for and what they were suddenly facing was nearly vertical. What followed at Elsenborn over the next several days is one of the more remarkable tactical stories of the entire Western War. The 99th didn't hold cleanly. There was confusion. There were positions that were overrun. There were communications that failed. There were men who were killed or captured before they could do much to prevent it. But the division held enough. It held enough to slow the German advance. It held enough to allow the 1st Infantry Division to move up onto the ridge and establish a coherent defensive line that the Germans, despite repeated and costly attacks over the following days, were never able to break. The 1st Division had fought at Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, had fought through the Hurtgen Forest, and had arrived at Elsenborn as a thoroughly seasoned formation with an institutional knowledge of defensive fighting that made a significant material difference. The integration of the two divisions' combat power, the experienced unit stabilizing and reinforcing the inexperienced one, is a lesson in combined arms command that was not accidental. It was the product of American Corps level command, doing its job under pressure. I want to spend some time on Kampfgruppe Pepper because it is the German formation most associated with the Northern Thrust, and because its story is, in its own way, a parable for the whole offensive. Joachim Peiper commanded the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, a powerful armoured force that was intended to drive rapidly through the American lines, cross the Ambleve and Salm rivers, and reach the Meuse. Peiper was, by any objective military assessment, an able and aggressive armoured commander. His force included among the most capable German troops and equipment in the offensive. On the first day, his column advanced significantly, pouring through a gap in the American line near Losheim and driving west at a pace that appeared to justify the optimistic German timetable. Then the roads failed him. The Ardennes road network, narrow and winding and bordered by forests that his heavy Tiger II tanks couldn't operate in, forced him onto specific routes that became bottlenecks. American units that shouldn't have been able to slow him did, because they held bridges and crossroads long enough to force him onto longer alternative routes. American engineers blew bridges. American quartermaster troops burned fuel dumps. Every delay compounded the next one. Peiper's column reached the town of Stoumont on the 19th of December and was halted there by American infantry and tank destroyer units. A combination of forces that, on paper, his armoured spearhead should have overwhelmed. The fact that it didn't tells you something important about the practical difference between what a unit looks like on an order of battle chart and what it can actually accomplish when its fuel is running low. Its supporting infantry is strung out along 50 kilometers of narrow road, and the enemy it's fighting has had 2 days to prepare defensive positions. By the 24th of December, Peiper's column was effectively encircled near Laglis, cut off from resupply, under attack from American forces that were growing stronger, unable to advance, and increasingly unable to defend its position. On the night of the 23rd to 24th, Peiper received permission to abandon his vehicles and break out on foot with his surviving men. He left behind most of his tanks, including a number of Tiger II heavy tanks that American technical intelligence teams would later examine with considerable interest. The most powerful armoured spearhead of the entire offensive ended its fighting career on foot in the dark, in a Belgian forest. The fighting on and around Elsenborn Ridge in the days of the 17th through the 22nd of December produced some of the highest American casualty rates of the entire battle. The 99th Infantry Division suffered extremely heavy losses in its first real engagement. a violent and unforgiving introduction to full-scale combat. The 1st Infantry Division, supplementing and then reinforcing the 99th, also took severe casualties in the defensive fighting. I want to be precise about this. Holding Elsenborn was not cheap, and the fact that it held should not obscure the cost at which it was held. The American soldiers in those positions were fighting in the same freezing temperatures, the same fog, the same tree-burst artillery as the men at Bastogne. But they were doing it without the later fame, without the famous quote, without the rescue narrative that gave the Bastogne story its dramatic arc. They were just men in foxholes on a ridge, and they held. The significance of Elsenborn Ridge for the overall outcome of the battle is something that military historians have been quite clear about, even if popular histories sometimes underplay it. The failure of the 6th SS Panzer Army to break through at Elsenborn condemned the entire offensive to a shallower and narrower penetration than the plan required. Dietrich's army was supposed to be the main effort, the northern armoured force that would provide the operational mass for the drive on Antwerp. Instead, it was bogged down in costly and unsuccessful attacks against a ridge held by American infantry and artillery. The 5th Panzer Army, further south, made deeper advances precisely because it faced thinner American positions. But those advances were made without the northern support the plan demanded, and they created a salient rather than a breakthrough. Elsenborn didn't just stop Dietrich. It fundamentally changed the geometry of the whole offensive, and changed it in a way that made Allied recovery possible. The artillery at Elsenborn Ridge is worth a specific paragraph because it was one of the decisive material factors in the defensive success and is something that military historians have pointed to as an example of American fire support coordination at its most effective. American artillery units on and behind the ridge massed their fires with a degree of coordination that German attackers found, by the accounts of those who survived and were later interrogated, almost impossible to advance against. The German attacks came in waves, infantry following tanks supported by their own artillery, and American counter-battery fire and direct defensive fires met each wave with a weight of shell that the Volksgrenadier divisions, already under strength and lightly equipped compared to regular Wehrmacht formations, couldn't sustain. The technical capacity for massed artillery coordination was an American institutional strength that had been developing through the whole course of the war. And at Elsenborn, it was exercised under the worst possible conditions, cold, under attack, with the fragmentary communication, with a professionalism that the German attackers paid for in the most direct way possible. By Christmas of 1944, the northern shoulder of the Allied line was secure, not comfortable. There was still fighting, still German probing, still the cold and the frostbite and the tree-burst shells. But the fundamental question of whether the 6th SS Panzer Army would break through at Elsenborn had been answered. It hadn't, and that answer meant that the shape of the Allied counteroffensive, when it came, would have a stable northern anchor from which to operate. The men of the 99th and the 1st, who had provided that anchor, were not thinking in those strategic terms on Christmas morning. They were thinking about warmth, about food, about the men they'd lost in the previous week. But the shape of what came after, the whole story of how the Bulge was reduced and the offensive defeated, rested on what they'd done on that ridge. There's a quiet kind of heroism in the Elsenborn story that doesn't translate easily into documentary drama. There was no famous quote, no single command decision that changed everything, no dramatic relief column breaking through on a specific date. There was just resistance, daily, grinding, costly, ultimately successful resistance by men who fought because there was fighting to be done and they were the ones there to do it. That resistance didn't win the Battle of the Bulge by itself. But without it, the battle would have been lost in its first week. I think about that sometimes when the famous moments get all the attention. The Nuts reply, the relief of Bastogne, Patton's turn. Those are real and important, but they happened inside a frame that Elsenborn made possible, and the men who made that frame deserve to be remembered clearly. Chapter 9, Christmas in the Ardennes, What the Holiday Meant. When the world was on fire, there's something about Christmas in a war that demands a kind of careful handling. It can be mawkish. The sentimentality can crowd out the truth. It can be used instrumentally as a device for emotional manipulation that flattens the complexity of what the men actually experienced. I want to try to do neither of those things here, and instead stay as close as I can to the documented record of what Christmas 1944 was actually like for the men fighting in the Ardennes, because the record is specific enough and human enough that it doesn't need embellishment. Christmas Eve in the Ardennes, 1944, was cold and clear. The skies that had closed over the battle on the 16th were now open, brilliantly, bitterly open. The kind of winter sky that makes the stars look closer than they are, and the cold feel more intense than a thermometer reading would suggest. In Bastogne, surrounded and fighting since the 19th, the men of the 101st Airborne celebrated Christmas Eve in whatever way the circumstances allowed. There was no formal celebration. The perimeter was under attack. The ammunition was rationed. The medical situation was still dire. But the men who were not on the line that night did what soldiers throughout history have done in the gaps between danger. They talked. They shared whatever food they had, and some of them, by the accounts collected later, sang, not for the sake of a documentary narrative, not because they'd been told to, but because it was Christmas, and because the alternative was not singing. The Christmas message that General McAuliffe issued to his troops on the 24th of December is worth quoting carefully because it captures something of the specific quality of that moment. McAuliffe wrote, "What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home. These are my answers. We have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west. We have identifications from 4 German panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 German parachute division. These units, spearheading the last desperate German lunge, were headed straight west for key American supply points. This battered bastards of Bastogne has become a household word. The phrase battered bastards of Bastogne appears to have been circulating among the troops before McAuliffe formalized it, and its adoption into official communication is a small but revealing detail. Commanders who listen to what their men are calling themselves understand something important about morale that commanders who don't listen tend to miss. On the German side of the perimeter that Christmas, the situation was its own kind of reflection. German soldiers in the foxholes of the Ardennes had been fighting since the 16th. 8 or 9 days of advance, confusion, cold, and combat. Many of them had believed, going into the offensive, that it might succeed quickly and decisively. By Christmas Eve, the evidence of the ground was telling them something different. The offensive had not reached the Meuse. Bastogne still held. The fuel situation was desperate. The Allied air forces, active again in the clear weather, were working over the roads behind them. German soldiers wrote in letters home. Letters that were sometimes captured and translated by American intelligence. About the cold, about exhaustion, about the gap between what they'd been told the offensive would achieve and what they could actually see from their positions. One such letter, quoted in Robert Merriam's contemporaneous history of the battle, described the Ardennes as a country that doesn't want us here. I don't know if that's a precise translation of the original German, And I want to be careful about attributing specific sentiment to a specific man I can't fully identify. But the sense of it, the feeling of fighting in a landscape that resisted rather than yielded, appears consistently enough in captured correspondence from this period to be taken seriously as a reflection of German soldier morale. The medical situation on both sides of the line at Christmas deserves specific attention because it was one of the most acute sources of suffering in the entire battle, and one that doesn't appear often enough in the popular narratives. American medical resources inside Bastogne had been compromised from the start. The main medical battalion had been captured in the opening German advance, and the remaining medical staff were working in improvised facilities without adequate supplies. Frostbite casualties had been accumulating for days, and the number of frostbite cases across the entire Ardennes front was staggering. By the end of the battle, frostbite would account for a significant fraction of total American casualties, in some units rivaling or exceeding the number of men wounded by direct enemy action. Frostbite at the level of severity common in the Ardennes that December is not a minor inconvenience. It causes the kind of tissue damage that can result in amputation. Men were losing fingers and toes and feet because they didn't have adequate winter clothing, because they'd been in their foxholes for days without being able to get warm, because the war had placed them in conditions that the human body is not designed to survive without proper protection. The chaplains of the Ardennes campaign deserve a paragraph of their own, because their role in the battle was both practically important and humanly revealing. American chaplains in the Second World War were not non-combatants in any meaningful operational sense. They moved through the lines, visited the wounded, conducted services under fire, and were present at the moments of maximum human need, in ways that their official non-combatant status completely failed to capture. In Bastogne, in the frozen forests of the northern shoulder, in the aid stations and improvised hospitals behind the lines, chaplains performed services on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day that men attended in their field gear, with rifles between their knees, sometimes with the sound of distant firing audible between hymns. Those services were not about theology in any abstract sense. They were about the specific human need, in conditions of extreme danger and extreme cold, for connection to something larger than the foxhole. And the chaplains who provided them were doing some of the most important psychological work of the entire battle. Christmas Day itself, the 25th of December, was operationally significant for reasons that the holiday's observance could not delay. German forces launched renewed attacks on Bastogne from multiple directions, the largest single-day effort to reduce the garrison since the encirclement began. The attacks were beaten back at cost. Further north, the 6th SS Panzer Army made another attempt to break through toward Liège that was stopped by the now solid American defensive line. On the southern face of the salient, Patton's Third Army continued its grinding northward advance. Christmas not being a day that armoured warfare pauses for, the operational tempo did not drop on the 25th. The cold did not relent. The men fighting that day were doing so with the same mixture of exhaustion and determination that had characterized the previous week, and the holiday was something they carried with them internally, rather than something the world around them acknowledged. There is a historiographical note I want to make here about the way Christmas 1944 has been used in narratives of the Battle of the Bulge. The holiday provides a natural, dramatic, and an emotional anchor point for storytellers, and that's not inherently wrong. The contrast between Christmas and combat is genuine and felt, and the men who were there felt it. But the risk is that the holiday becomes the story, when the actual story is the fighting and the dying and the holding of lines that happened to be occurring at Christmas. The men of the 101st didn't hold Bastogne because it was Christmas. They held it because they were soldiers, because they had orders, because holding was what the situation required, and because the men next to them were holding too. The holiday is context, it's not the cause. By the morning of the 26th of December, the first tank of Patton's relief column reached the southern perimeter of Bastogne. The lead vehicle, from the 4th Armoured Division, crossed through the German encircling forces in the early afternoon. And within hours, the road from the south was open and supply convoys were moving. The relief didn't end the fighting around Bastogne. German forces continued to pressure the town and the supply corridor for weeks. But it ended the siege, and with it the most acute crisis of the entire battle. The men inside the perimeter, who had been surrounded for 7 days, who had rationed their ammunition and operated without adequate medical supplies, and dug their foxholes in iron-hard ground, and watched German tanks come at them from 3 directions, were now connected again to the supply network of the Allied armies. More ammunition was coming, more food was coming, and the corridor, however narrow and contested, was open. The relief of Bastogne on the 26th of December is, rightly, one of the signature moments of the Battle of the Bulge. But I want to end this chapter with a thought about what it actually represented strategically, because I think the drama of the moment sometimes obscures the larger picture. The relief of Bastogne did not end the German offensive. It did not shrink the salient. It did not restore the Allied line to what it had been on the 15th of December. What it did was prevent the worst possible outcome in one critical location. The battle had weeks to run. The hard grinding work of pushing the Bulge back, mile by mile, road junction by road junction, in temperatures that would remain brutal through January, had barely begun. Christmas was over. The war was not. Chapter 10. The counteroffensive begins. Eisenhower, Montgomery, and the command crisis. Of all the controversies generated by the Battle of the Bulge, and there were several, none was more immediate, more politically charged, or more damaging to Allied relations than the command arrangements that Eisenhower put in place on the 20th of December, 1944, and the way those arrangements were subsequently handled in public by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. It is a story about military command, about personality, about national pride, and about the specific friction that arises when different institutional cultures are forced to operate within the same command structure under conditions of extreme pressure. It is also, I should say, upfront, a story in which historians have been taking sides for 80 years, and I don't think it's possible to give a fully balanced account without acknowledging that. The decision Eisenhower made on the 20th of December was, in operational terms, straightforward. The German advance had effectively cut the American 12th Army Group in two. The forces north of the salient were having difficulty communicating with, let alone being directed by, General Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg, which was itself at risk of being overrun. To restore coherent command of the northern shoulder, the 1st Army and the 9th Army, Eisenhower temporarily transferred them from Bradley's 12th Army Group to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Montgomery, commanding from the north, would direct the defense and eventual counterattack on the northern face of the salient, while Bradley directed the southern effort. It was a pragmatic decision driven by the realities of communications and geography. It was also, for Bradley, and for American opinion generally, a decision that stung. Montgomery arrived at the headquarters of the American First Army on the 20th of December in a manner that its commander, General Courtney Hodges, found galling. Accounts from American officers present describe Montgomery arriving like Christ come to cleanse the temple, brisk, confident, and visibly assessing the situation in a way that communicated, whether intentionally or not, a verdict that the Americans had made a mess that he was now going to sort out. Montgomery later said this characterization was unfair and that he was simply doing his job with his customary efficiency. The American officers who were there disagreed. The personal dynamics of that meeting cast a shadow over the operational relationship between Montgomery and the American commanders for the remainder of the battle and beyond. What Montgomery actually did with command of the Northern forces is a subject of genuine historical debate. His first priority, which was to stabilize the northern shoulder before undertaking counterattacks, was militarily sound, and most serious historians acknowledge this, even those who are broadly critical of Montgomery. The northern line needed consolidating before it could push south. Montgomery moved the 82nd Airborne to better positions, shuffled armored reserves, and prepared a coherent defensive line that would become the launching pad for the Allied northern counteroffensive. His caution was, in operational terms, defensible. His critics, chiefly Patton, but also many American staff officers, felt that greater aggression in the first days of Allied advantage could have cut off and destroyed a significant portion of the German forces in the salient before they could withdraw. Whether that's correct is genuinely unknowable, because Montgomery didn't try it, and we can't run the alternative history. What we can say is that the methodical approach he chose succeeded, slowly, at cost, but it succeeded. The public relations disaster came at the beginning of January 1945. Montgomery gave a press conference in which he described the Battle of the Bulge in terms that, to American ears, sounded like he was claiming primary credit for the Allied defense and recovery. He spoke of how he had tidied up the battle, of how he had employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. Language that, stripped of context, implied the British had saved the Americans from their own failure. The reaction in the American press and among American commanders was furious. Eisenhower drafted a cable to the combined chiefs of staff, saying that either Montgomery went or he did. The British High Command, recognizing the seriousness of the crisis, intervened. Montgomery was persuaded to issue a statement acknowledging American leadership and the American achievement in the battle. The immediate crisis passed, but the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery, already strained, never fully recovered. I want to be fair to Montgomery here, because the popular caricature of him as simply a credit grabber misses something important. His actual operational conduct during the northern phase of the Ardennes battle was, by most technical measures, competent. He stabilized a shaky line, coordinated British and American forces on the northern shoulder, and prepared a counteroffensive that ultimately contributed to the compression of the salient. His instinct for caution, his preference for building up overwhelming force before attacking, rather than attacking with what was available and accepting higher casualties, reflected a genuine strategic philosophy shaped by his experience of the catastrophic British losses in the First World War. He wasn't wrong that the northern line needed stabilizing before it could counterattack. What he was wrong about, egregiously, damaging, almost incomprehensibly wrong, was the tone in which he communicated his role to the press and to his colleagues. The operational achievement and the political handling of it were two completely different things, and Montgomery failed comprehensively at the second, even when he succeeded at the first. Patton, commanding the Third Army in the south, was his own kind of command challenge. His rapid turn northward to relieve Bastogne was, as noted, a genuine feat of military organization, something that most commanders of that era would not have attempted in that time frame. But Patton was also consistently pressing Eisenhower for a more aggressive strategy than Eisenhower was prepared to sanction. Specifically, a deeper drive that would cut the salient at the base rather than gradually compressing it. Patton believed, and argued with considerable force, that the German forces in the salient could be encircled and destroyed if the Allies moved quickly and aggressively enough, rather than simply pushed back. Eisenhower's response was that the risk of overextension, of moving so fast that the Allied flanks became vulnerable, was too great given the winter conditions and the supply situation. The debate between the two was genuine and professional, argued through military channels rather than the press. Patton disagreed with his commander's decision, and then, when the decision was made, executed his orders with full professional commitment. That's not a small thing. The ability to disagree strongly and then execute loyally is one of the qualities that distinguishes for professional military command from the alternatives. The Allied plan for the counteroffensive, as it took shape through the last week of December and the first days of January, was a pincer. Montgomery's forces attacking south from the northern face of the salient, while Patton's forces attacked north from the south. The objective was not to destroy the German forces in the salient. Eisenhower judged that an encirclement was too ambitious given the conditions, but to compress the salient and eventually pinch off the westward bulge, restoring something close to the original line. This was, from a classical military theory perspective, the conservative option. It would take longer. It would push the Germans back rather than trapping them. It would allow a significant proportion of the German forces in the salient to withdraw before the pincer closed completely. Patton hated it. Montgomery, ironically, also had reservations about the timing and the pace, though for different reasons. But Eisenhower's judgment was that the conservative approach was right for the circumstances, and subsequent events suggest that his assessment was, on balance, correct. The counter-offensive succeeded, at the cost that a winter offensive in those conditions was always going to impose. The command crisis of December and January reveals something important about the nature of coalition warfare that doesn't always survive the compression into popular narrative. Fighting as an alliance, as a genuinely unified command structure, requires something beyond good intentions and formal organizational charts. It requires a degree of institutional trust, personal respect, and willingness to subordinate national interest to collective purpose that is enormously difficult to sustain under the specific pressures of a major military crisis. The Allied command in the Ardennes was, by any objective measure, deeply strained by the German attack, by the redistribution of forces, by the press conference, by the conflicting strategic visions of its most prominent commanders, that it held together, that the counter-offensive proceeded with reasonable coherence, that the political damage was contained before it became strategically damaging. These are not automatic outcomes. They were the product of Eisenhower's particular genius for coalition management, which is a different and in many ways harder skill than tactical brilliance. He was not, by his own acknowledgement, the most operationally gifted general in the theatre, but he was the best man for the job he actually had. Chapter 11. The Long Pushback, January 1945, and the compression of the salient January in the Ardennes was, if anything, colder than December had been. The temperature in the first week of the new year fell to levels that combat engineers later described as making mechanical work on vehicles nearly impossible. Hydraulic fluid thickened, engine oil congealed, lubricants in small arms failed to perform as designed. The ground, already frozen hard since November, was now at depths that made any serious fieldwork almost impossible. In this environment, the Allied counteroffensive began its methodical push to compress the salient and restore the original front line. A task that, in theory, required simply reversing the ground lost since the 16th of December, but which in practice was one of the hardest pieces of fighting the Allied armies had undertaken since the breakout from Normandy. The two-pronged Allied counterattack, Montgomery from the north, Patton from the south, began in earnest on the 3rd of January, 1945. The northern attack was spearheaded by the American First Army, reinforced by British armoured and infantry formations, and its objective was to push south and east, driving down through the Belgian highlands toward the town of Eifel, where it was planned to link up with Patton's northward advance and cut the salient's main east-west road artery. Eifel itself was a small town of no inherent importance, but it sat astride the main road from the eastern end of the salient to the west, and capturing it would sever the principal German supply and withdrawal route. The pace of the advance from the north was, from the start, slower than the optimistic planning had anticipated. Winter conditions, German resistance, and the terrain all conspired to reduce the daily advance to kilometers measured in single digits, rather than the tens that summer operations had accustomed Allied commanders to expect. On the southern face, Patton's Third Army was grinding forward against German positions that had been organized and reinforced over the preceding week. The Germans knew the relief of Bastogne had changed the situation fundamentally, and their defensive posture along the southern face of the salient, they reflected that knowledge. They were digging in, organizing defensive lines, placing their remaining armored strength in counterattack positions designed to slow the American advance as long as possible. Patton's men were fighting through terrain that the January cold had made even less hospitable than it had been in December. The snow on the ground was now deeper, the roads more treacherous, and the frozen trees and hedgerows that defined the Ardennes landscape had become defensive assets for the Germans, who had had time to prepare positions that the advancing Americans had to attack directly, without the option of flanking maneuvers on ground that vehicles couldn't cross. I want to spend time on the individual infantry soldiers' experience of this period, because the counteroffensive phase of the Battle of the Bulge is sometimes treated as the solution phase, the part where the problem is being fixed, and that framing can make it sound easier than it was. The men who conducted the counteroffensive were the same men who had survived the German attack. Battered divisions that had been fighting continuously for more than 2 weeks, in temperatures that had been causing frostbite casualties throughout, now being asked to attack rather than defend, to move forward rather than hold in place, in conditions that remained as physically brutal as anything they'd experienced since the battle began. Sergeant John Klein of the 8th Corps, whose unit was involved in the northward push from Bastogne, recalled the January fighting as in some ways harder than the initial German assault. At least when they were coming at us, we were dug in. Now we were the ones crossing open fields. That distinction between the attacker exposed in the open and the defender dug into prepared positions is a fundamental one in infantry combat, and the January fighting in the Ardennes imposed it fully on the Allied units making the advance. The German withdrawal from the salient, when it came, was conducted with the professional efficiency that characterized the Wehrmacht at its best, even in its most difficult circumstances. German units didn't simply collapse and run. They fought delaying actions, held positions long enough to allow other units to withdraw to the next defensible line, and in several cases launched local counterattacks that temporarily retook ground the Allies had captured at considerable cost. The standard of German small unit tactical competence in the January fighting was, by the accounts of American officers who faced it, high, sometimes astonishingly high, given the material disadvantages the Germans were operating under. The men of the Volksgrenadier and Panzergrenadier divisions, who conducted these fighting withdrawals, were cold, tired, running short of everything and fighting a battle their command had told them was supposed to have been won by Christmas. They kept fighting anyway, and they made the Allied advance pay for every kilometre. The town of St. Vith, which the Germans had captured after days of hard fighting in the opening phase of the battle, was retaken by American forces on the 23rd of January. By that time, it was largely rubble. The German occupation and the fighting associated with it had left almost nothing standing of the town as it had existed before the 16th of December. The recapture of St. Vith was a significant moment because the town had been the first major American position to fall in the German offensive, and its retaking marked the point at which the German gains were effectively being erased. But there was nothing to celebrate in the physical reality of what had been St. Vith. Just ruins in the snow, and men who'd fought to take it and were now standing in what was left of it, cold and alive, and trying to figure out what came next. The meeting of the northern and southern Allied columns at Hofeleis on the 16th of January 1945 was the operational milestone that confirmed the salient had been compressed and effectively eliminated. The two American forces that shook hands in the rubble of that small town had been fighting their way toward each other for almost 2 weeks, and their meeting meant that the Germans' supply route through Hofeleis was cut, that the original Allied front line was being restored, and that the last major German offensive in the West had failed. The German forces that had been in the salient, many of them, not all, had withdrawn east before the closing of the pincers, fighting their way back to the positions from which they'd started in December. They took their losses. They lost a great deal of equipment. They arrived back on the German side of the original line, weakened and exhausted, but they weren't destroyed in the encirclement that Patton had hoped for, and that distinction would matter in the fighting that followed in February and March. One of the less discussed aspects of the Allied counteroffensive is the role of logistics in making it possible, a subject that doesn't generate the dramatic imagery of armoured advances and famous quotes, but which was, at the operational level, as important as anything that happened at the sharp end. The Allies fed and fueled and supplied an army of more than 600,000 men in the Ardennes through the winter of 44 to 45 across a road network that was being used simultaneously for military transport and for the movement of refugees and civilian traffic, in temperatures that made mechanical breakdowns a constant operational hazard. The American logistics system, the Red Ball Express routes, the rail lines running back through Belgium and France, the supply depots and distribution networks, had been stretched by the German attack, and then stretched further by the counteroffensive. That it worked, that the fighting divisions at the front received ammunition and food and fuel in the quantities required to sustain their operations, was not automatic. It was the product of tens of thousands of men in rear area positions doing unglamorous essential work in conditions that were nearly as harsh as those at the front. German fuel and supply shortages during the withdrawal were, by January, critical. The Luftwaffe had lost its ability to contest Allied air superiority in any meaningful way after Bodenplatte, and Allied tactical air forces were operating essentially freely over the Ardennes and the German lines of communication behind it. German armoured units withdrawing east were making their way along roads that were under air attack for most of the daylight hours, moving at night when they could, hiding in forests and under bridges when they couldn't, and losing vehicles and equipment at a rate that the German war economy could no longer replace. The columns of abandoned and destroyed German vehicles left along the roads of the Ardennes in January represented in their collective immobility the failure of the whole enterprise. A force that had driven west with operational confidence was now retreating east under Allied air power in the dark on empty tanks. By the end of January 1945, the front line in the Ardennes was approximately where it had been on the 15th of December, restored, not without cost, to something close to the position from which the German offensive had erupted 6 weeks earlier. The human cost of those 6 weeks is worth stating directly. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge totaled more than 75,000 killed, wounded, and captured, making it the costliest battle in American military history in terms of total casualties in a single engagement. German losses were comparable in number and, given Germany's narrower manpower base, strategically more damaging. The Belgian civilian population had suffered terribly, caught between the armies, displaced from their homes, subjected to German occupation, and then the violence of liberation, in the coldest winter in living memory. The Ardennes that January was our landscape of burned villages, cratered roads, frozen bodies not yet recovered, and the detritus of 6 weeks of large-scale mechanized warfare left in the fields and forests. The battle was over, technically, by the end of January. The scars of it would take decades to heal. Chapter 12. Chapter 12. What the generals learned. Strategic and tactical lessons from the Ardennes. There's a particular quality to the after-action reports generated by the Battle of the Bulge that distinguishes them from those produced after most other major engagements. The surprise, the sheer, undeniable, documented fact of Allied intelligence failure, gave those reports an unusual frankness. When you've been caught this badly, there's a limit to how much defensive self-justification you can work into your official assessment. The Army Ground Forces observers, who compiled the initial American analyses, were direct in a way that institutional documents rarely are. There had been a failure, the failure had sources, the sources needed to be understood. I find those early reports among the most honest military documents I've encountered from this period, precisely because the scale of the surprise made dishonesty difficult. The intelligence failure that allowed the German offensive to achieve complete surprise is the lesson that received the most immediate attention, and rightly so, at every level of the intelligence structure. From the strategic assessment made by Schaef's Intelligence Directorate down to the Corps and Division G2 sections in the Ardennes sector, the existing indications of German offensive preparation had been systematically underweighted, and the prevailing assumption of German exhaustion and incapacity had been systematically overweighted. General Eisenhower's acknowledgement cited earlier that there had been a shocking deficiency in intelligence was not merely an admission of failure, but an accurate diagnosis. The deficiency was structural, not merely a matter of individual analyst incompetence. The culture of intelligence assessment in the autumn of 1944 had become too closely tied to the operational optimism of the period, too willing to fit ambiguous evidence into a framework that confirmed what commanders wanted to believe. The corrective that the Ardennes demanded was not simply more collection, but better analysis, a greater willingness to follow evidence toward uncomfortable conclusions. The tactical lessons were equally significant, and in some cases more immediately actionable. The American Army's experience in the Ardennes drove substantial changes in how winter warfare was prepared for, how cold weather equipment was distributed and used, and how medical services handled environmental casualties. The frostbite toll, thousands of men removed from effective duty by preventable cold injuries, was the most visible symptom of a systemic failure of preparation that senior medical and logistics officers acknowledged clearly. The solution was partly material, better winter clothing and equipment distributed as a priority rather than as an afterthought, and partly procedural, explicit guidance to unit commanders on rotations of men in exposed positions on the importance of dry socks and waterproof footwear, on the signs of early frostbite, and the importance of reporting it before it reached an irreversible stage. These seem like small things against the backdrop of a major land battle. They weren't small to the men who lost toes. The performance of the road junction defences, the stands at St. Vith and Bastogne in particular, generated detailed analysis of the conditions under which lightly equipped forces could successfully defend against armoured assault in restricted terrain. The key factors that emerged from that analysis were not dramatically counterintuitive, but they were clearly stated for the first time from direct Ardennes experience. The value of holding ground that constrained armoured movement, the decisive importance of artillery concentration in breaking up infantry armour attacks, the morale premium of command presence and clear communication in surrounded positions. The 101st Airborne's defence of Bastogne had demonstrated something that wasn't obvious from doctrine, that a formation without adequate anti-tank weapons or heavy artillery could nonetheless defeat repeated armoured attacks if it held terrain that channeled enemy movement and maintained accurate artillery fire on predictable approach routes. This was a genuine tactical insight, bought at a high price. The Ardennes also taught, or reinforced, a lesson about the relationship between air power and ground operations that had been developing throughout the campaign in France, and was now confirmed in the most direct way possible. The 7 or 8 days during which Allied tactical air forces were grounded by weather had corresponded almost exactly with the period of maximum German advance. When the weather cleared, the German advance stopped. The correlation wasn't perfect. The American resistance at Elsenborn and the road junction defences had also slowed the German timetable independently of air power. But the contribution of Allied air superiority to the outcome of the battle was documented and understood. The implications for how Allied commanders thought about the relationship between their ground operations and the availability of tactical air support were significant, and they affected planning for the Rhine crossing operations that followed in the spring. The debate about whether Montgomery's caution in the north cost the Allies a decisive encirclement of the German forces in the salient, a debate that has never been fully resolved, is, I think, a less productive focus than it sometimes receives. The question of whether a faster, more aggressive northern counterattack in the first days of Allied advantage could have cut the salient at the base and trapped the German forces inside it is genuinely unanswerable. We don't know what the Germans would have done in response, and we don't know whether the Allied forces available in early January had the strength and supply reserves to execute such a maneuver without creating dangerous overextensions of their own. What we do know is that the approach actually taken succeeded in its objectives, at the cost that winter combat in that terrain was going to impose regardless of tactical approach. Historians who argue that an encirclement was possible are not wrong to make the argument. They're wrong to treat it as certain. Military history is not a controlled experiment. The German lessons from the Ardennes were bleaker and more final. The offensive had consumed the last significant strategic reserve of the Wehrmacht in the west, the Panzer formations, the Volksgrenadier divisions, the accumulated fuel and ammunition stocks, in an operation that had failed to achieve any of its stated objectives. The 6th SS Panzer Army was withdrawn from the Ardennes for transfer to Hungary, where Hitler had convinced himself that a defensive operation to protect the Hungarian oil fields was the strategic priority. The depleted divisions that remained on the Western Front were in no condition to mount serious resistance to the Allied offensives that would begin in February. The Rhine, which in September of 1944 had seemed a formidable long-term objective, was now a near-term reality. The Ardennes had not restored German strategic position. It had consumed the resources needed to maintain it. The post-war historiography of the Battle of the Bulge is itself a subject worth a brief digression, because the way the battle has been remembered and interpreted has shifted considerably over the 80 years since it ended. The immediate American accounts, written in the late 1940s and early 50s, tended to focus heavily on the heroic narrative. Bastogne, McAuliffe's reply, Patton's relief column, and somewhat less on the structural failures that had made the crisis possible in the first place. British accounts, shaped by Montgomery's public statements and the press conference controversy, often carried an implicit subtext about the relative merits of British and American generalship that Americans found irritating and that the documentary record doesn't fully support. The German memoirs that began appearing in the 1950s, many of them written by the senior commanders who had planned and conducted the offensive, were valuable for their operational detail, but needed to be read with an awareness that their authors had significant personal and professional interests in how the story was told. The most reliable histories, in my reading, are those that draw on all of these sources, while maintaining a critical awareness of what each source was and wasn't positioned to see. The veterans of the Ardennes carried the battle with them in ways that continued to shape their lives, decades after the fighting ended. The specific quality of that winter, the cold above all else, but also the specific darkness and the fog, and the sound of artillery in frozen forest, appears consistently in the memoirs and interviews collected by the National World War II Museum and other archives. Men who had been in the Ardennes talked about the cold, the way men who had been at sea talked about the water, as a physical environment that had entered them at a level deeper than memory. That could be reactivated by a cold morning or a winter fog in ways they hadn't predicted and couldn't always explain. Chapter 13. The human cost, casualties, prisoners, and the civilians caught between the armies. There is a number I want to state clearly at the beginning of this chapter, because it is the kind of number that tends to get absorbed into strategic analysis without being fully felt. More than 75,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the Battle of the Bulge, the largest single battle casualty total in American military history. That figure sits alongside estimated German losses of between 60,000 and 100,000, depending on the source and the methodology used. A historiographical variance that itself tells you something about how difficult it is to pin down precise numbers in the chaos of a 6-week winter battle fought over a large area with fragmentary record-keeping on one side and outright destruction of records on the other. And then there are the Belgian and Luxembourgish civilians, who are the least counted category and among the most directly affected. Thousands displaced from their homes, hundreds killed in the fighting, their villages and farms and livelihoods, caught in a battle they had no part in starting and no ability to escape. I want to begin with the prisoners, because the story of American prisoners taken in the Ardennes is one that doesn't always receive the attention it deserves, and that has its own specific texture of suffering, distinct from the suffering of men killed or wounded in action. The largest single group of American prisoners taken in the battle were the soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division's 2 encircled regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, who surrendered in the Schnee Eifel on the 19th of December 1944. The number of men who surrendered with those regiments was approximately 8,000, though precise figures vary in the historical record. These men were marched east into Germany in winter conditions, fed inadequately if at all, housed in camps that were overcrowded and in many cases without adequate shelter, and in some cases, subjected to treatment that violated the provisions of the Geneva Convention. The march east was, for the weakest men, lethal. Men who fell behind were left in the snow. Men who were too sick to walk were in some cases shot. The experience of American prisoners of war in Germany in the winter of 1944 to 45 was shaped by the deteriorating condition of the German state itself. The prisoner of war camps, the stalags, were operating under conditions of food and fuel shortages that affected German civilians and soldiers as well as prisoners. Though the distribution of those shortages was not equal, prisoners received less than German civilians. Work details sent out from the camps were sometimes brutal. The liberation of these camps by advancing Allied forces in the spring of 1945 would produce images that shocked even men who had been through the worst of the fighting. Not because the prisoner of war camps were equivalent to the extermination system further east, but because the condition of the men released from them was a direct indictment of what imprisonment under a deteriorating totalitarian state in its final months actually meant in practice. The wounded of the Ardennes are their own category of suffering. The battlefield medical system in the winter of 1944 to 45 was strained to breaking point by the combination of combat casualties and environmental casualties. The frostbite cases, the trench foot, the hypothermia. American field hospitals behind the Ardennes front were, in the days immediately after the 16th of December, receiving casualties faster than they could process them. In facilities that had been designed for the quiet sector, the Ardennes was supposed to be. The improvised nature of much of the medical care in the early phase of the battle. Surgeons operating in farmhouses and barns, in temperatures that made anesthetics behave unpredictably, with supply lines that had been disrupted by the German advance, meant that some men who might have survived with better resources did not. The men who did survive serious wounds faced the additional physical ordeal of evacuation across a road network that was simultaneously being used for resupply and reinforcement. In ambulances and trucks that moved slowly over icy roads, in temperatures that no amount of blankets fully compensated for. Frostbite deserves its own specific paragraph, and I want to be blunt about it, because I think its scale and its consequences are routinely underplayed. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, frostbite and related cold injuries had produced approximately 45,000 non-battle casualties in the American forces alone, a number so large that it equaled or exceeded combat casualties in some units and significantly degraded the effective strength of divisions that were needed for the counteroffensive. The causes were multiple and had been documented in reports from earlier winter fighting. Inadequate cold weather clothing and equipment issued at unit level, insufficient rotation of men in exposed positions, command cultures that in some units discouraged reporting of cold injuries as a sign of weakness, and the practical impossibility of keeping men dry in foxholes in the Ardennes in December and January. The corrective measures taken after the battle, better equipment distribution, explicit doctrine for cold weather rotation, changed reporting culture, were sound, but they came too late for the thousands of men who lost fingers and toes and feet in the snow of the Ardennes. The Belgian and Luxembourgish civilians, caught in the path of the German advance, occupy a part of the Battle of the Bulge's history that has been more thoroughly examined by European historians than by American ones, and I think that asymmetry is worth acknowledging. The German occupation of the retaken Belgian and Luxembourg towns in the days following the 16th of December was not benign. In some areas, German forces treated the civilian population with the harshness characteristic of occupation elsewhere in Europe, demanding billeting, requisitioning food and transport, restricting movement. In a small number of documented cases, Belgian civilians were killed by German forces. The village of Stavelot, through which Kampfgruppe Piper passed, saw civilian killings that were later investigated as war crimes. The documentation is clear on this and shouldn't be elided in a history that aims for completeness. The refugees of the Ardennes battle are another category that tends to disappear from military histories focused on operational events. Tens of thousands of Belgian and Luxembourgish civilians fled their homes ahead of and during the German advance, moving west on the same roads that American military traffic was using, creating a humanitarian crisis layered on top of the military one. American military commanders, dealing simultaneously with combat operations, supply shortages, and the confusion of a shattered front, were not always well positioned to manage the refugee flow. And the interactions between military necessity and civilian need were sometimes resolved in ways that prioritized the military and left the civilian consequences to be dealt with later. The men and women who walked out of the Ardennes with whatever they could carry in the coldest winter in memory and returned later to find their homes destroyed or looted or simply gone are part of the human ledger of this battle, and they belong in any complete account of it. The medical treatment of German prisoners captured by Allied forces during the battle is worth a specific mention, because it provides a direct comparison to the treatment of American prisoners by the Germans. American military medical policy in the Second World War required that German prisoners receive equivalent medical treatment to American soldiers, a policy that was, by the accounts of the medical officers who implemented it, generally followed in the Ardennes, even under the strain of the initial battle. German wounded brought into American field hospitals were treated by the same surgeons who were treating American casualties, in the same facilities, with the same limited, under the circumstances, resources. This was not universal. There were cases of mistreatment of German prisoners by individual American soldiers, documented in court-martial records, but the institutional standard was clear and was, in the main, upheld. I mention this not to make a moral comparison, but because the difference in institutional standards between the two sides is itself a historical fact that belongs in a complete account. The long-term psychological consequences of the Battle of the Bulge for the men who fought it are documented most extensively in the oral histories collected decades after the war by the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, by the National World War II Museum, and by individual researchers whose interview collections are archived at universities on both sides of the Atlantic. What those interviews convey, read carefully, is not a uniform narrative of trauma, but a varied and human mixture. Men who were haunted by specific moments, men who had made a kind of peace with what they'd experienced, men who found that the Ardennes receded into the background of lives lived after, and men for whom it never did. The cold is the recurring element. It appears in almost every account, regardless of the larger emotional shape of what the veteran is describing. The cold of the Ardennes seems to have entered the men who survived it in a way that persisted beyond the battle's end. I want to close this chapter with a specific number that I think is the most important single statistic from the human cost of the Battle of the Bulge, and it is this. Of the more than 1 million men who fought in the Ardennes, American, British, German, Belgian, the great majority were, by the standards of that war, young. The average age of an American infantryman in the Ardennes was somewhere in his early 20s. The German Volksgrenadier divisions contained boys of 17 and men in their late 40s. The 101st Airborne had men in it who had jumped into Normandy only 6 months before. Men who, if they'd been born 10 years earlier or 10 years later, would have led entirely different lives. The Battle of the Bulge was, at its human foundation, a battle fought by young people in terrible conditions for reasons that the young people themselves couldn't always see clearly from inside the foxhole. That doesn't change the outcome or the strategic significance. But it is, I think, the truth that the statistics point toward, and it's one worth holding as we move toward the final accounting. Chapter 14, The Road to the Rhine. How the Ardennes changed the final phase of the war. The Battle of the Bulge ended. Officially, in most historical accounts, somewhere around the 25th of January 1945, when the last German forces had been pushed back to approximately the positions they'd held before the 16th of December. That date is somewhat arbitrary. The fighting along certain portions of the front continued past it, and the operational consequences of the battle extended far beyond any single end date. But the Bulge was gone. The salient had been compressed and eliminated. The original Allied line was roughly restored, and now, on both sides of that restored line, commanders were looking at what the battle had cost them and what it meant for what came next. What it meant for the Germans was stark and, in retrospect, decisive. The Wehrmacht had committed its last significant strategic reserve in the West to the Ardennes offensive, and that reserve was now spent. The armoured formations that had attacked in December, the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer divisions, the 2nd and 9th, and 47th and 58th Panzer Corps, had taken severe losses in men and equipment. The 66th SS Panzer Army was transferred to Hungary, removing it entirely from the theatre, where the decisive battles of the final phase would be fought. The Volksgrenadier divisions that had provided the infantry mass for the offensive were shattered. The fuel stocks that had been accumulated over months of careful hoarding were gone. The Luftwaffe, after Bodenplatte, was functionally incapable of providing meaningful air support over the Western Front. The German military position in the West, already under severe pressure before the 16th of December, had been made dramatically worse by the failure of the one operation that was supposed to restore it. Hitler's gamble had not paid off. It had instead consumed the chips. For the Allies, the end of the Ardennes battle opened the path to the Rhine, not easily or immediately, but as a realistic operational objective within weeks rather than months. The planning for the Rhine crossing operations, Operation Veritable in the north, designed to clear the west bank of the Rhine between Nijmegen and Wesel, and Operation Grenade, the American crossing further south, had been disrupted and delayed by the German offensive. Now those operations could proceed against a German defense that was demonstrably weaker than it had been in December. The American 1st and 3rd Armies, which had spent 6 weeks fighting in the Ardennes, were exhausted and needed rebuilding. But the institutional knowledge they'd gained about winter combat, about German defensive tactics, and about the specific terrain and conditions of the German frontier made them more capable formations than they'd been in November, even name accounting for their casualties. Experience, even brutal experience, has military value. The question of whether the Ardennes offensive actually accelerated the end of the war in the West by consuming German resources that would otherwise have prolonged resistance on the Rhine is one that military historians have engaged with seriously, and I don't think it should be dismissed. The German formations committed to the offensive would, if held in reserve, have been available to contest the Rhine crossings and the subsequent drive into Germany. Their loss in the Ardennes may have made those later operations less costly than they would otherwise have been. This is, again, counterfactual history. We can't know what the Rhine fighting would have looked like against a more intact German reserve, but the operational logic is sound, and several serious historians of the final phase of the war have argued that the Ardennes, paradoxically, brought the end of the European war weeks closer by destroying the forces that were Germany's last defensive reserve in the West. The planning for the Rhine crossings in February and March of 1945 drew directly on lessons from the Ardennes. The intelligence apparatus that had failed so comprehensively in November and early December was reorganized, and its analytical culture was deliberately changed. More weight given to evidence of enemy capability, less to assumptions about enemy intent based on overall strategic assessment. The winter equipment shortfalls that had produced the frostbite catastrophe were addressed with a priority that earlier requests for better cold weather gear had never received. The logistics system was rebuilt and extended, drawing on the experience of keeping a 600,000-man force supplied through a Belgian winter. These were institutional improvements, unsexy, undramatic, documented in supply tables and reorganization charts rather than in the narrative of battles. But they were real, and they mattered for the campaigns that followed. The Remagen Bridge, the Ludendorff Railway Bridge across the Rhine at Remagen, which American forces of the 9th Armored Division captured intact on the 7th of March, 1945, was the dramatic punctuation point that marked the beginning of the end of organized German resistance in the West. The bridge's capture was not planned. It was the result of a patrol discovering, against all reasonable expectation, that the Germans had not yet destroyed it. The patrol commander, First Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, made the decision to attempt a crossing without waiting for orders from higher command. A decision that, had the bridge been destroyed as he crossed, would have been a footnote of individual tragedy rather than the hinge point it became. It held. American forces poured across. The Rhine, which had been Germany's last natural defensive line in the West, was breached. The Ardennes, in retrospect, had been the last moment at which Germany had the resources to prevent this from happening. And those resources had been spent in the snow of Belgium and Luxembourg, rather than on the banks of the Rhine, where they might have done more lasting damage. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had expressed his private opposition to the Ardennes offensive from the beginning, was relieved of command in March of 1945. Not for the first time, and not for the last time, in his troubled relationship with Hitler, his replacement, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, arrived to find a situation that was beyond the reach of any commander to improve, however able. The West Wall had been breached. The Rhine was crossed. The Ruhr, the industrial heart of German war production, was being encircled. The Ardennes had been the last time the German army in the West had the capacity to influence the strategic situation through offensive action. Everything from that point was a fighting retreat toward an end that the senior German commanders could see clearly, whatever their public statements suggested. The relationship between the failure in the Ardennes and the decisions made in Berlin in the final months of the war is a subject that requires careful handling. Hitler's response to the failure of the Ardennes offensive was not, as rational analysis might suggest, a recalibration toward negotiated terms or a realistic assessment of what defensive operations in the West could still achieve. It was, instead, a characteristic intensification of the fantasy that had driven the offensive in the first place. The belief that some combination of new weapons, new units, new offensives, and, above all, the will to continue, could still change the outcome. The V-Weapons program continued. Planning for new offensive operations was initiated, even as the Rhine crossings proceeded. The fantasy persisted in the face of evidence that should have dissolved it, because the psychological and political structure of the Third Reich in its final phase was one in which the gap between reality and official narrative had become structural rather than incidental. The Ardennes hadn't created that gap, but its failure had made the gap wider and more visible, and the effort required to maintain the official narrative more desperate. For the men who had fought in the Ardennes and then continued fighting through the Rhine crossings and into Germany in the spring of 1945, the transition from the frozen hell of the Bulge to the rapid advance of the final weeks of the war was, by their accounts, jarring in a way that was hard to process in real time. The same men who had been fighting for their lives in Belgian foxholes in January were, by April, driving through German villages that were putting up white sheets. The contrast between the grinding resistance of the Ardennes and the sometimes rapid collapse of German organized resistance in the final weeks was real, and it produced in many soldiers a kind of emotional dislocation. Not relief, exactly, but something more complicated than relief. The Ardennes had established a baseline of what the war was capable of producing in terms of violence and cold and death. The spring advance, for all its relative speed, was haunted by that baseline. Men who'd survived the Bulge knew what bad could look like, and that knowledge shaped how they moved through a disintegrating Germany in ways that are documented in their letters and diaries and, later, their memoirs. The Rhine crossing operations of February and March 1945 are beyond the formal scope of the Battle of the Bulge, but they are its direct operational consequence, and any account of the Ardennes that doesn't gesture toward what followed is incomplete. The battle didn't end on the 25th of January. It ended in its consequences sometime in May of 1945, when German forces surrendered and the war in Europe was over. The 90 days of the Bulge, from the 16th of December through the end of January, were the hinge on which the last phase of the European war turned. They were the last moment of German offensive capacity in the West. They were the last time the outcome of the war in Europe was genuinely in question, in even the most optimistic German calculation. After the Ardennes, the question was not whether Germany would be defeated. The question was how long it would take, and at what further cost. Those are not small questions, but they are different, qualitatively different, from the questions that had been open on the 15th of December. The Battle of the Bulge closed them. Chapter 15. What remains, legacy, memory, and why the Ardennes still matters. There is a village in the Belgian Ardennes called Foy. It sits on a ridge above a valley, and it looks, in the winter, exactly as it might have looked in December of 1944. Bare trees, grey sky, fields that seem to go on longer than they should before the forest closes around them again. I've read enough first-hand accounts of the fighting in and around Foy to feel, when I look at photographs of it, the specific quality of that landscape. The way the open ground between the tree line and the first houses would have felt to a man attacking across it, or defending it, or trying to hold it in temperatures that crack the stocks of rifles. The landscape of the Ardennes is not dramatic in the way that, say, the beaches of Normandy or the ruins of Stalingrad are dramatic. It's quiet, it's grey, and it holds its history the way cold ground holds everything, closely, and for a long time. The legacy of the Battle of the Bulge operates on several different levels simultaneously, and I want to try to address them separately, because conflating them produces confusion rather than clarity. There is the military historical legacy, the specific lessons about intelligence, logistics, winter warfare, command, and coalition management that the battle generated and that shaped the subsequent development of Western military doctrine. There is the political legacy, the strains and adjustments in the Anglo-American alliance that the battle's command controversies produced, and their long-term effects on the post-war relationship between Britain and the United States. There is the cultural legacy, the way the battle has been represented in film and literature and popular history, and what those representations have gotten right and gotten wrong. And then there is what I'd call the personal legacy, the way the battle lived on in the men who fought it, and in the families of those men and in the communities of Belgium and Luxembourg, where the battle happened and where the physical evidence of it can still sometimes be found. The military historical legacy is, in professional military terms, substantial and well documented. The intelligence reforms that followed the Ardennes surprise shaped the organization and analytical culture of American intelligence for decades. The recognition that institutional optimisms could systematically distort intelligence assessments, that analysts would unconsciously fit ambiguous evidence into the framework that their commanders wanted to see, was a genuinely important insight, and it recurs as a lesson in intelligence training and doctrine to the present day. The term mirror imaging, the tendency to assume that an adversary will behave the way you would behave in their situation, is a concept that can be traced in American intelligence doctrine, partly to the specific failure of November and December 1944. The Ardennes didn't create the problem, but it documented it so thoroughly and at such cost that it was impossible to ignore. The winter warfare doctrine developed after the Ardennes is another element of the military historical legacy that deserves mention. The American army went into the Ardennes without adequate cold weather doctrine or equipment, and paid for that deficiency in frostbite casualties that equaled or exceeded combat losses in some units. What came out of the post-war analysis was a systematic approach to cold weather operations, clothing standards, rotation doctrine, medical protocols for environmental casualties, that was formalized into army doctrine in the late 1940s, and that was drawn on directly in the Korean War, which began 5 years after the Ardennes ended and produced its own brutal winter fighting. The line from the Ardennes to the Chosin Reservoir is not direct, but it is real, and the institutional memory carried by American officers and NCOs who had survived the Bulge and were still serving in 1950 was part of what made the Marine Corps' fighting withdrawal from Chosin possible as an organized military operation rather than a rout. The Anglo-American alliance and its Ardennes strains have a legacy that played out in complex ways over the following decades. The immediate command controversy, Montgomery's press conference, Eisenhower's near ultimatum, the formal smoothing over, was resolved at the time but not forgotten. The pattern it exemplified, genuine operational cooperation between Allied armies combined with persistent friction at the level of personality, national pride, and command philosophy, was a pattern that recurred in the post-war Atlantic Alliance and in the various coalition operations that followed. Historians of NATO and of the post-war Anglo-American relationship have noted that the Ardennes controversy contributed to a certain institutional wariness in American military culture about the conditions under which command of American forces should be transferred to non-American commanders. A wariness that has never fully disappeared and that surfaced periodically in alliance debates through the Cold War and beyond. The cultural legacy of the Battle of the Bulge is, in the English-speaking world, primarily American, primarily focused on Bastogne, and primarily shaped by a small number of powerful representations that have accumulated over the decades. The story of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the encirclement, the nuts reply, the relief, was established as the signature narrative of the battle almost immediately, and subsequent representations have reinforced it. The film Battleground, released in 1949, was the first major cinematic treatment and focused on Bastogne. The miniseries Band of Brothers, produced 60 years after the battle and drawing on Stephen Ambrose's book of the same name, introduced the Ardennes, and specifically the fighting around Foy and Bastogne, to a generation that hadn't grown up with the living memory of it. Both representations have significant historical value. They convey the physical experience of the battle, the texture of cold and exhaustion, and camaraderie and loss, with a vividness that purely analytical history sometimes can't achieve. Both also have the limitations of their specific focus. Bastogne, the 101st, the heroic narrative, the stands at Elsenborn Ridge, the tragedy of the 106th Division, the grinding counteroffensive of January. These are less cinematically legible and receive less cultural space accordingly. I want to say something specific about Stephen Ambrose here, because his writing on the Battle of the Bulge and on the Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment has shaped popular understanding of the battle more than almost any other single source, and it deserves both credit and careful assessment. Ambrose was a gifted narrative historian, a writer who could take archival material and oral testimony and turn it into prose that moved readers in ways that academic history often can't. His reconstruction of the Ardennes fighting, based on extensive interviews with veterans, is among the most vivid available. The historiographical concern that later emerged about some of his sourcing practices, questions about the accuracy and attribution of certain direct quotes in his work, doesn't invalidate the larger picture, but it does require the careful reader to treat some of the more dramatic individual quotations in his books with the same caution that should be applied to any primary source. Awareness of the circumstances of its production, the perspective of its author, and the purposes to which it has been put. The Belgian and Luxembourgish memory of the Battle of the Bulge is quite different from the American one, and the difference is instructive. In Belgium and Luxembourg, the battle is remembered not primarily as a story of heroic stands and famous quotes, though those stories are known and respected, but as a catastrophe that happened to a civilian population. The villages that were destroyed in the fighting, Bastogne, St. Vith, Houffalize, L'Église, dozens of smaller communities, were rebuilt after the war. But the rebuilding took years, and in some cases decades, and the memory of what was lost in the fighting is local rather than national, specific rather than general. In the Belgian Ardennes, 80 years after the battle, there are still families who can tell you exactly what their grandparents' house looked like before December of 1944, and exactly what it looked like afterward, and what it cost in labor and time and money to make it habitable again. That memory is not heroic. It is practical and specific and human, and it belongs alongside the American military narrative as part of the complete picture of what the battle was. The battlefield memorials and cemeteries of the Ardennes are, I think, among the most moving places in Europe, if you visit them with any preparation at all. The American Military Cemetery at Henri-Chapelle in eastern Belgium contains more than 7,000 American graves. Men killed in the fighting in and around the Ardennes and the subsequent advance into Germany. The graves are the white marble crosses and stars of David that characterize American military cemeteries, and they stand in the same orderly rows on the same manicured ground as every other American cemetery in Europe. But the landscape behind them, the Belgian hills and forest, the grey winter sky if you visit in December, gives Henri-Chapelle a specific quality that the Normandy Cemetery, with its ocean view, doesn't have. You're in the middle of the landscape where the men in those graves died. The forest is the same forest. The cold, if you go in winter, is recognizable. The distance between the grave and the ground is very small. The German military cemetery at Racon, near Bastogne, contains more than 6,000 German graves. It is, like all German military cemeteries in Belgium, marked by flat, dark basalt crosses rather than white marble, a visual austerity that reflects the post-war conventions of German commemoration, the desire to mark without glorifying, to remember without celebrating. The graves at Racon include soldiers of the Volksgrenadier divisions and the SS Panzer divisions, Men of multiple ages and from multiple parts of Germany, buried in the ground of a country they were sent to conquer, and in the end couldn't hold. I find the German cemeteries of the Ardennes important to include in any complete account of the battle, not to draw a false moral equivalence between the armies that fought there, but because the men in those graves were also, at the individual human level, the sons and brothers and husbands of people who mourned them. The war that killed them was a war they were ordered to fight, under a regime that the historical record has judged with clarity and finality. But the grief of the people who lost them was real, and it belongs in the picture. Why does the Battle of the Bulge still matter, 80 years later? I've been turning that question over throughout this entire documentary, and I want to try to give it a real answer rather than a generic one. It matters militarily because the specific failures it exposed, in intelligence, in winter preparation, in coalition command management, are failures that military organizations are perpetually at risk of repeating. And the documented record of what happened in the Ardennes is one of the most thorough case studies available of how those failures compound and what they cost. It matters politically because the Anglo-American alliance that was strained by the command controversies of December and January was also, ultimately, the alliance that won the war, and understanding how it held together under that strain tells us something important about what makes alliances durable. It matters humanly because more than 1 million people were in those forests and on those roads and in those foxholes, in the worst conditions that a European winter could provide, doing things that determined the shape of the world that followed. And because the specific texture of their experience, documented in letters and diaries, and after-action reports and oral histories, is part of the human record that we lose something by forgetting. And it matters, finally, because the Ardennes is one of those rare historical episodes where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, where the difference between what happened and what might have happened was the product of individual decisions, individual stands, individual moments of stubbornness or courage or simple refusal to quit in the cold. That contingency, the sense that history could have gone differently, and that what prevented it from going differently was the actions of specific human beings, is the thing that makes history worth studying rather than simply noting. The Battle of the Bulge is full of those moments, and they belong to all of us.